Meeting of the Planning Commission. And can we have a roll call? Well, actually, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance first. Sure, would you like to lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Okay, Commissioner Anderson. Commissioner Fresco. Vice Chair Lambert.
Here.
Commissioner Landris.
Here.
Commissioner McKinnon. Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Chair Fonda Bernardi.
Here. Okay, Planning
Can we-
Director's report.
Let's do our,
Okay, can I make a motion first? So just so people in the audience will know what we're doing. I would move that we move 8B up to the front of the agenda because it should be a relatively short item. And unless there are people here in opposition to 8B, that we proceed without a staff report, if we can do that in one motion.
can we do it one more? Great. Second.
You don't mind we have children here?
Here.
Do item 8A.
This will go very fast.
I'll second. I seconded. Yeah.
Okay. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay.
So we'll do that before item 7?
Yes.
We
Yeah.
just did 8B. so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and may I'm going to move that I believe we have members of the public here for 8A. Can we take 8A before 7A? We're literally moving to take the agenda in reverse order.
Except Nina should really be here for 8A, so we should not do that.
We should not do that. Okay.
Okay. Well,
We're going to
So-
do planning director's report first.
Wait, so are we hopping back into the agenda with Planning Director's report, and then we'll move on to 8B? Is
Yeah.
that where we're at? Okay.
I think, so we have not voted on 8B? Okay, sorry.
No,
yeah,
Just
so we're
it's
going to,
about just to reorder the agenda.
Yeah.
okay.
We got to do the planning director's report first.
Let me, if I may ask, we do not have consent items on our calendar. Can we treat an item as consent?
Right, so unfortunately, consent is not listed on your agenda this evening. So because it's not for Brown Act purposes, it would be better for you to do it as Commissioner Lambert suggested.
Okay. So we are going to move that question since we had it after the staff report, right? Okay. Planning Director's report.
I think just a couple of short items to give you an update on since we've been meeting more frequently here. Just wanted to let you know about upcoming Planning Commission meetings. June 4th, special meeting. This is a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday. We're planning on having a presentation on the Promenade 3.0 update, and also looking at bringing forward a resolution of intention for the Planning Commission to potentially make a recommendation going forward on some targeted zoning changes for promenade uses and related activities. We're also looking at the continued item for the alcohol CUP for 2827 Pico Boulevard. That was on your agenda from last week. We're bringing that forward on June 4th. Also a parking variance for 1633 Oceanfront Walk, which is hot dog on a stick. This is a variance that this commission has seen before, and so it's being renewed in essence. And then finally, there's a map on Delaware Avenue. The June 19th meeting is a regular meeting. We are going to bring back the Pico Boulevard zoning changes, that red line that we spent some time on. Following anticipated outreach with Friends of Sunset Park. Staff and the neighborhood group are working actively on securing that date and making sure information is provided that's helpful for that outreach effort. And then we're going to spend the remainder of the evening on an R1 zoning standards update to recap what we've heard out of the working group, and then also the 3 community open houses. It was nice to see different planning commissioners at those various meetings, so thank you for your attendance at those. Also had a great turnout from the community as well. So we don't have anything else on that item, on that evening's agenda, to give you all time to discuss it. And just looking ahead, you know this, May 28th, we have the 401 Montana Avenue conditional use permit appeal for the Rainbow Garden Learning Center. That's scheduled. And then we'll update you on future council items at the next meeting.
Okay, any questions?
Craig wants to talk.
We have some different names on the
I know.
machine right now. Apparently, I'm Craig, and this is Barbara.
They got the genders right anyway.
Okay. I was curious whether I believe it's the May 28th originally was a date that had been anticipated for a housing-related discussion at council. That's been pushed, right?
Right. We are looking at tentatively, if you're talking about the new housing models.
Yeah.
We are planning on a study session at council on June 25th.
Okay.
I'll keep you all updated if that date moves, but that's the date we are working toward actively.
And the corporate housing ordinance?
Corporate housing / medium-term housing
Yeah.
will be discussed under the umbrella of the new housing models
Got it.
study session. So
Great.
it'll be folded in.
Thank you. And do we have a representative from the commission for the appeal
I can't.
as our chair?
May
selected?
28th.
Yeah. I'm not recalling if.
We didn't do that.
It's our chair or our chair's designate. So,
Yes.
okay.
Okay, we'll do that at the end of our meeting.
Okay.
We'll-
I just want to say something about the R1 effort, and I want to recognize Ross. Those workshops, in fact, someone actually came up to me, a woman who's a professor, and she said she organizes classes obviously all the time, and she had never seen a more well-organized planning presentation in Santa Monica. So that kudos to you and to Tony. Very, very, very well done, the whole process so far. So thank you.
Yeah, I would like to second that. What I really liked is the fact that the choices were very crisp and clear, and it was easy to document people's decision. There was no interpreting scrawled handwritings. And the last thing I thought that was very good is the way it was spread out. There was no crowding. You could move very quickly. You could be in and out of there instead of waiting for your table to talk, and then people talk, and then they don't agree, and you're there till midnight. So I liked the way it was very organized and very crisp. So.
It was. I don't think that's the kind of thing you're supposed to announce on the dais. I also really appreciated the dedication of the staff across the planning staff. I think there were familiar faces for us, but I think they were familiar. Everybody probably who had been involved in a planning process at some point in the city saw a familiar face somewhere in the room, which made a tremendous difference. And I think the same person must have come up to me as well. It was yeah. I mean, it was really great to hear that, and certainly a reflection of the efforts that the planning department has undertaken in recent years to help imagine a decision-making and input-giving process that is meaningful for residents and usable by staff and commissioners and ultimately the council. So thank you and kudos. I was curious whether the turnout, I went midday. This is sort of bleeding into planning commissioner announcements, I suppose, just to say that I was there yesterday during the day. But I was curious whether the turnout reflected the diversity of R1 or whether there were other ways that people could give input who maybe didn't attend.
So all the open houses turned out to be similar to the one you came to. So about 60 individuals at each of the open houses. There are going to be plenty of other opportunities for anyone to contribute comments. They can still email us. They will hopefully also show up to Planning Commission. So that was just kind of the initial outreach after the technical working group that we already had conducted.
I just wanted to point out, I heard from one of the participants who's been involved in the effort that the Tuesday night meeting was the population was somewhat different in terms of being architects and non-R1 residents and what have you. And I reminded him that everybody gets a voice.
True.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's hard to sometimes decide which one's the architects and which ones are the property owners. But there was a definitely a different vibe to each of the open houses, but I think it was always good input that we needed to hear from a variety, not just one voice. So
Right.
it was great.
And we did hear, I mean, I did hear from a couple of members of the public that they were looking for some certainty in the scheduling of what was going to happen relative to the previous, when the IZO happened, right, that there had been that things moved a little bit more quickly. And so that they both appreciated the warning, but they also reiterated that they looked forward to being advised on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, we are trying to be as transparent as possible through this process. We have heard the exact thing that you just said in regards to the IZO, so we're trying to do this one a little bit better. So thank you.
We're talking about the R1 meeting.
Yeah, one meeting, yeah.
Could I just comment about that R1 meeting I was at yesterday? I thought that was an excellent presentation by you guys. Really thoroughly well done, and one of the best ones I've seen in the last 8 or 9 years, so congratulations on that. Well, it was. There was a lot of planning people there, but I think the way it was put together and the responsiveness of everyone was quite striking. It took a lot of planning, Commissioner Landis.
All right, we're on to item 7A, the Wilshire Safety Study.
Wait a minute, we're voting on 8B.
You want to do
Let's
8B? Okay.
Sorry.
Do you want to go back to, did you want to finish out planning commissioner announcements?
Yeah.
Just while we're,
Well, are there any?
I have a question of the acting planning director. When do we get our mobility and bike plan review for 2018?
I had discussed that with David, and I will have to check back with you on that. We hope that presentation can be in the works. We will certainly check in with
Because you know I ask this every meeting.
I know you do.
And that's pretty much
I
the
know.
same response I get every evening.
I
So when-
apologize, I don't have a more complete response.
I think next time we need to have a date. We're 6 months overdue on that.
Okay. Let's finish off 8B.
If you could do disclosures, please.
Yeah, are there any ex parte communications regarding that?
No.
I had a discussion with Mary Marlowe, who is one of the people who has written
That's
We're going
8B.
to 8B.
The bank.
on the bank. Okay,
We
no.
moved
We're moving
8B
the
up.
Yeah. Okay, so will someone move that item?
I already did.
I
No,
know.
she moved to it, the staff report.
No,
I'm sorry.
I moved to move it up the agenda.
Yeah, and now it's
oh,
here.
now, okay, I
Now
move
we have-
approval of the staff recommendation.
Thank you.
Second.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Chair, I had a statement I wanted to make related to disclosures. I just wanted to disclose that I am a City National Bank customer. The City National Bank is the applicant, but I am able to consider the application in an objective manner. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. All those in favor of item 8B?
Yeah, we're going to do roll call. So we have a motion to approve,
It's been
and we
seconded.
have a second?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's vote. Vice Chair Lambert,
Yes.
Commissioner Landris.
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon,
Yes.
Commissioner Perry,
Yes.
Chair Fonda Bernardo.
Yes.
All right, that motion passes.
Okay, finally, we get to traffic safety.
All right, good evening. My name is Joe Sanclementi. I'm a principal transportation planner with the city's mobility division. I want to thank you for having us tonight to talk about the Wilshire Safety Study. I'm joined here tonight by my colleague Scott Johnson. I work with mobility, as well as Nat Gale from Tool Design Group, who is leading our study team.
Who did the bank?
No, I don't think so.
That's fine. Yeah.
Thanks. Appreciate it. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so tonight we have a few brief slides. What I'd like to do is talk about how the Wilshire Safety Study fits in with the city's Friendly Road Division Zero program. We have our consultant here that is going to highlight some initial safety data and talk about some of the detailed analysis that we're going to be undertaking, as well as some preliminary feedback that we received from a variety of different stakeholders, and talk about next steps over a 12-month study that we have laid out for this project. So take the Friendly Road for Santa Monica. A couple of months ago, my other colleague, Jason Klieger, had come to this commission to give a presentation on the Friendly Road. So just a really quick recap about what that is. The Friendly Road is the city's roadway safety campaign, which is based on Vision Zero principles. Vision Zero is a worldwide movement to eliminate fatal, severe, and traffic-related injuries through education, enforcement, and engineering. The city had made a commitment to eliminate fatal and severe injury crashes by the year 2026. Through this effort, our staff has developed a comprehensive map of the city, taking a look at where fatal and severe crashes are occurring by taking a look at crash data over an 11-year period from 2006 to 2016. And what this resulted in is a series of blue lines, which really represent about 10% of the city streets where we're having the highest occurrence of severe and fatal crashes. In addition, we've also pulled out 10 priority intersections where we have had the highest occurrence of severe and fatal crashes. Now, as we were developing this map, one thing that really stood out to us is that there were 4 locations along Wilshire Boulevard, as well as much of the corridor itself is, you can see, highlighted in blues. About the time that this map was created, there was an opportunity through Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation. There was a grant program that came out. We used this information to go after that grant, and we were lucky enough to be awarded a grant to conduct a very detailed safety assessment. So the study corridor for this project will look at Wilshire Boulevard for its entirety in the city of Santa Monica. It's 2.4 miles long. There's 55 intersections along that corridor when you include the alleyway, so it's a pretty comprehensive study area. This is a very significant corridor, both regionally and local, connecting the ocean all the way to downtown LA. It serves Metro bus service as well as Big Blue Bus, and it really serves as a key destination, particularly in the downtown, where there's a lot of cross streets, people actively crossing these roadways. It's busy commercial and residential areas. There's 2 hospitals along the corridor, schools and parks. So our goal here is really to understand what is happening out there and develop targeted countermeasures to address severe and fatal crashes along this corridor. Now, as part of this effort, we've been working very closely with our Friendly Road team. And you may have seen the lawn signs. I know that we showed these at Commission probably a couple months ago, where they're started primarily at school locations to provide targeted messaging to really encourage people to observe better behaviors like look up, don't look down at your cell phone, drive slowly. We're using the same branding tools and messaging along the Wilshire corridor. So you may have seen these banners that went up the first week in May that are driving folks to a new website that we've set up specifically for the Wilshire safety study. And then also, we're just out in the corridor last Friday where we have stenciled stop, look, wave stencils. This is at the intersection of 18th Street in Wilshire, with the goal of trying to raise awareness for pedestrians to make eye contact as they cross the intersection. We were joined by a council member, Hara, as well as we had the Pacific Christian High School and the Pilgrim Lutheran Church, who have shown that they really want to be involved as part of this process and have been an active participant already to date. We also are planning on creating targeted messaging along some of the big belly trash cans along the corridor, both either to provide helpful statistics about safety issues along the corridor and to help drive public comment as we work through this study effort. The Friendly Road campaign has also developed a new website just in the last couple of months that has gone live in the last probably month and a half or so. And as part of this, I'm excited about a feature that we have added. It's an interactive mapping feature. The feature is intended to be citywide and used for planning purposes, where people can insert a pin onto the map and then provide specific detail about an issue that they're experiencing. What we're asking folks to do as part of the Wilshire study is to focus their pin pushing along the Wilshire corridor, just so that we can help identify any issues that we might not be either seeing that are coming through the crash data or that we might not be able to determine through other methods. So with that, what I'd like to do is have Nat talk a little bit more in depth about the study.
Thank you, Joe, and good evening, commissioners. My name is Nat Gale. I am a planner and an engineer at Tool Design, and we are supporting the city in this safety analysis. So first, just want to give a big picture overview of the objectives of this study, objectives that were tied to the grant application process. So first and foremost, much like the goals of Vision Zero initiative broadly, we want to use a data-driven process to really understand the trends that are happening with safety along the corridor. And we're here to talk about the preliminary data sources and some of the trends that we're observing. We recognize that quantitative data is not enough. We also need to understand qualitative data and lived experiences along the corridor. So we want to gather information from community stakeholders to understand the existing context as well. That data is just as important and valuable. We'll use those pieces of information to develop options for some very targeted safety enhancements. As you heard Joe mention, corridor has 55 intersections, 2.4 miles. It's a lot of things to study, and we have to be very focused with addressing problems that arise through this data analysis. Through those improvements, we want to encourage safe and accessible linkages to homes, to business, and to transit. Again, the corridor is a very significant transit corridor in terms of serving Big Blue Bus and Metro, and that's an important focus of this as well. And through that effort, we want to identify both short-term things that can be implemented in a quick time frame that may address some of the immediate safety issues, as well as longer-term capital improvements that may take a little bit longer time to both design and obtain funding to construct. So some project milestones: we are still in the very preliminary phase of doing outreach to talk about the study goals, some of the preliminary information. Our first community meeting will occur on Saturday, June 8th, and we have some more details on that at the end of the presentation. Over the summer, we'll use this preliminary data that we gather to identify those focus areas, and at the end of the summer begin to draft some preliminary recommendations, where we'll come back to another round of community engagement to present those preliminary recommendations and hear how they're received before we make some final recommendations at the end of the calendar year, and then the grant period ends in early 2020. So we're going to do a quick dive into some of the preliminary data. What we have to present here today are preliminary observations. We're still early in this data analysis and collection process, so we're not making any recommendations. We're just presenting some preliminary findings. And before we go into some of those data findings, just wanted to make a note on the data sources that we're using and some of the time periods that we're looking at. So we're studying collisions along along Wilshire Boulevard in City Santa Monica. The first data source that we use is called SWITRS in the transportation world. It stands for the Statewide Integrated Traffic Records System, and it is a statewide database of all the collision records. And we're looking at 5 years to understand systemic safety issues along the corridor. We use 5 years because Federal Highways recommends 3 to 5 years of safety data to understand trends of crashes that happen along a corridor. If you go back further than 5 years to try to identify trends, there may be changing conditions in how the street is designed or it's being used or operated. The second data source that we use is direct police reports from Santa Monica Police Department. Those are really helpful because they contain highly detailed context information about movements and conditions and include a narrative, right? So we use those to understand targeted issues that are happening along the corridor. And again, we'll talk a little bit about how we're using those data sets. So first, we wanted to do a little bit of a side-by-side between Wilshire and the city. When Jason was here a couple of months ago, he gave some citywide statistics, and we wanted to compare that to what's happening on Wilshire. So this is a breakdown of higher injury crashes by mode, by travel mode. So people walking, biking, on a motorcycle, or driving, the types of collisions that happen that result in injury along the corridor. The key takeaway here, the first thing that we noticed, if you see the citywide data, 28% of those higher injury crashes are bicycle crashes, whereas on Wilshire, that number drops down to 12%. And that's an indication that it's not a primarily bicycle corridor, and you know, that's one of the things that we identified from the very beginning. Wilshire is a transit and pedestrian corridor. There are alternate routes for bicycling along through Santa Monica. So that is an important thing for us to take note of in terms of how we focus what types of collisions we're investigating and what types of solutions we design. Really what we see here is, you know, a need to focus on the crashes involving people walking, because that's where the majority of those severe and fatal crashes are happening, that yellow and red number. When we then look at violations, and so this is, you know, for every police report, there will be a primary collision factor that led to that crash. When we compare Wilshire to the city of Santa Monica, the trends are about the same. Automobile right-of-way, unsafe speed, pedestrian right-of-way, improper turning, traffic signals and signs are the top 5 for both citywide and Wilshire. One thing to note again here is that the number for pedestrian right-of-way for Wilshire Boulevard, just in terms of percent overall share of crashes, is higher than citywide, again indicating there's a lot of demand for pedestrian activity, for pedestrian destinations on the corridor, and so again, we'll be looking at, you know, those crashes in particular to understand some of the trends that are happening along the corridor. Then we look at the share of collisions involving people walking and biking. So citywide, if we're again just thinking about people walking, you see that about 40% of the fatal and serious injury collisions involve people walking for citywide crashes. But then when we again drill into just the Wilshire Boulevard data, that number jumps up to 60%. Now these are low numbers, right? 6, 1, 1, 2, 10 fatal and serious injury crashes. You know, that when you zero into a you know, targeted location, you have less information to deal with, and that's why it's important to not just look at the systemic data, but to really look at every single crash that happens. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a moment. Again, some of the statistics you heard from Jason were the share of older adults that are involved in crashes that result in death and serious injury citywide, and the trend here is similar on Wilshire. We have the vast majority of the fatal and serious injury crashes involving older adults along Wilshire Boulevard. So again, this is our responsibility to drill down into what does that mean, right? What's actually happening at every individual crash location, and what are improvements that will address these issues. Time of day is another helpful way to understand trends along the corridor. So this is a chart of when crashes are happening along Wilshire, and you see that there's a spike in crashes in the middle of the day. One of the things that we observe is there are middle of the day generators for pedestrian activity, lunchtime areas. But you see that trend sort of hold steady over the afternoon and peak PM period as well. This tracks with a lot of what we see in other corridors and traffic safety in general. Last, just for a basic understanding of the data, this is a collision diagram that we've prepared using the police report data. So this helps drill down into the targeted issues that are happening at each intersection. So this is 16th and Wilshire Boulevard. And this is where we can really understand, is it rear end crashes? Are there left turn crashes, right turn crashes, crashes involving people walking or biking? This is not that systemic look, not that 5-year, pattern analysis. Now we have every single collision mapped in the intersection to understand what types of treatments will help address the issues that we're seeing. So I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this quantitative data is really important, really helpful, really begins to tell the story of what's happening on the corridor. But we also need to hear from community members, from stakeholders along the corridor, what is their feedback to help us target additional data analysis, additional investigation. So who are we talking to? We've presented at 3 different neighborhood associations that touch Wilshire Boulevard. We are looking at Santa Monica Works Go requests. This is the public service request system that helps us understand what sort of demands are being made for safety along the corridor. We're talking to Big Blue bus operators. We went out and actually interviewed a few operators along Wilshire to know what their issues and concerns are. Police and fire and emergency response, very critically important. Wilshire Boulevard is a main corridor where there's a lot of emergency activity. Residents, business owners, we've met with the Downtown Santa Monica Business Association, as well as other institutions along the corridor, hospitals, schools. You heard Joe mention Pacifica Christian. Those are all really important conversations to understand what's happening that doesn't get shown in that crash data. So some key themes we've heard from these preliminary conversations. Lighting is a big issue. We've heard that there are issues with crossing at night, difficult to see or be seen activity at night. We've heard some concerns with crossings at locations that are unsignalized, so there's no traffic signal. There's just a ability to cross the street, but not actually control the traffic, the vehicle traffic, as well as potential conflicts in those locations with the presence of that median along Wilshire Boulevard. We've heard a significant amount of desire to lower speeds along the corridor, and that will lead to safer outcomes, as well as a desire for less congestion. And in some of those preliminary conversations with bus operators, we've heard that there are a lot of conflicts at bus stop locations for getting on and off the bus, where there may be street furniture or other mobility devices in the way, and also difficult for the operator to pull in and out of traffic. So what does the data show for some of these key themes? Again, that's our initial task, is to investigate how the data tracks with some of the issues that we're hearing. So this first graphic looks at collisions in the dark. And so this is nighttime crashes. Again, we begin to start to identify some patterns and trends. So 11th Street is that big hot spot in the center of the chart there. So that is worthy of additional investigation, right? We don't know what that means, but we know that it means we need to investigate it more, right? So these are the types of patterns and trends that we're beginning to identify. Severity by intersection type. So again, we break down the corridor.
Can I just, while you're on that slide, what's that? You have a similar dark spot that isn't labeled on the far right. Just wondered what that is.
On the far right here?
Yeah, it's above the word Boulevard in Santa Monica Boulevard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yes, sorry.
What is that?
That, I believe, is Harvard Street.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I think it's Harvard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. Again, we've broken the corridor down by intersection type, so you have presence of a signal, unsignalized, as well as there are crashes that happen mid-block. And so, one of the things that we're beginning to identify here is the majority of the crashes happen at the intersection, signalized or unsignalized. Two-way stop controls, the unsignalized intersections. And so here, we really need to learn more about the rate of crashes that are happening at these locations, right? What we see are the trends are relatively similar for signalized and two-way stop controlled. Again, you're beginning to see a potential trend, that gray bar. There's a slight uptick in the severe crashes at two-way stop control locations. But we need to again, compare that with the volume of traffic activity, as well as the number of signalized intersections. And so just, again, this is like a deep dive, right, into the traffic analysis that we're doing. To just give a sense of what we're looking for, right? These are some of our field observations where we're at unsignalized locations, those two-way stop controlled locations, and we're seeing all sorts of different activity that could be risky movements or could lead to some of the crashes we see on the collision diagrams, right? So left-turning vehicles from the side street going onto Wilshire, as well as vehicles traveling along Wilshire making a left turn onto the side street. We see a lot of opportunity for potential crashes there. That's an important part of our data gathering process, actually going out and observing conditions in the field as well. For signalized intersections, again, we're interested in left turn. The transportation research shows that left turn crashes are often some of the most severe. And so here we're beginning to break the corridor down into what we call signalized permissive, where you are permitted to make a left turn, but you have to make a judgment call, right? You've all been in that situation where you got the green light, traffic is coming towards you, so you have to make a judgment call of when you make that left turn, versus a protected left turn, right? You have that green arrow. And whether or not the rates of crashes are different at those two conditions. And we're starting to see some key intersections where there are more crashes than others. Again, we don't know if that's a trend. The numbers are pretty small, and so we have to go in and investigate in detail. We're also looking at vehicle volumes, right? This comment that we hear about speed and congestion. The first thing we can do is look at the sheer volume of vehicles along the corridor. And we're beginning to see there are patterns that actually track with the land use in the corridor as well, where you have high volumes on the eastern end that get smaller as you get towards the ocean. Lincoln is this divider. That's where you see this chart go from red to blue, because the volumes do significantly drop as you continue to move west. So those are some of just the preliminary observations that we're seeing with the data. I am going to pass it back over to Joe to talk a little bit about what we're doing with this data and next steps for the grant.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
So what we really want to raise awareness about is that we are going to have this, our first community workshop on June 8th at Reed Park Auditorium. And we've sent out about, I think, 13,000 postcards this week to everyone within 1,000 feet of the corridor. We're also going to be handing out flyers and door hangers to help raise awareness. We're really trying to get a cross-section of different people and different users. I think that the crash data alone really only tells us sort of a snapshot of whether a crash was reported at that location, but not all crashes are reported. For the most part, if there wasn't an injury involved, a crash record doesn't occur. So I think that by talking to different people, understanding different times of day, different days of the week, what happens out there, we want to make sure that we're looking at all the different locations along that corridor and not missing anything that we should focus on. So I think this is just the flyer that is going to be handed out, and we have some information on santamonica.gov/Friendly Road, which is the Friendly Road website. And on that website, we're going to be updating information about the Friendly Road campaign, as well as project-specific information, including the Wilshire project. We've also set up a Wilshire-specific email address, which is safe.wilshire@smgov.net. So we're asking folks, if you have specific concerns, please email them to us and/or use the interactive map that can be accessed on the Friendly Road website. And once again, santamonica.gov/Friendly Road. And really, we're here, I guess, how can folks help? Really want to get the word out, try to get as many different people involved as we can. Over the next few months, we're actually, at the community meeting on the 8th, our intent is to provide more detailed data assessment based on our observations that are out there, but also provide an opportunity to identify other things that we need to go out in the field and take a look at. Over the summer months, we'll be conducting additional data collection and starting to develop alternatives. And our goal is to come in the fall and have a second community meeting where we might have some recommendations, but I do see this as potential that we'll probably have some alternative treatments that could be applied at certain locations where we could use some assistance identifying preferences. And I think I would like to ask the commission if you'd be willing to do a joint planning commission community meeting or type workshop, maybe focused on sussing out some of these alternatives and really coming up with what preferences might be, knowing that then we would go back, refine these potential treatments before we develop our final recommendations. I think that we have a very tight timeline with the grant. It's a 12-month timeline that expires in February. We don't have the opportunity to do any extensions, so we're trying to be as methodical as we can in our process, and we're definitely looking for any assistance and input. And with that, I'm happy to leave it to some questions.
Okay, Richard.
Very thorough report, and wonderful to see that you're concentrating on this area. People don't ride down that street because it's really narrow and incredibly dangerous and heart-threatening at all times when you're on a bike. But we have encouraged people to walk down there. And it does seem from the initial statistics that you put up, people do that, and then they're at higher risk because they walk. Is that your initial impression? That because of the way pedestrians are certainly on those statistics, seem to be a disproportionately high target audience for crashes?
Right. And I think that's what this study aims to
So that was
find
a
out.
yes, right?
Yes. We have great sidewalks. For the most part, they're wide and accommodating out there, and it's really when you're crossing the boulevard.
Crossing road. So
that
that
we're
brings
trying
me
to
to my
focus
second
on.
point.
Yes.
So you have some signalised intersection information up there. But anecdotally, if you drive along that road, any pedestrian who walks across the road at an unmarked or an unsignalised intersection at any time of the day or night is likely to be under threat, if not hit. So a lot of those aren't reported, particularly if they're setting off from the middle part, that little piece of concrete that's in the middle, and starting to walk across, and the lane closest to them stops. Inevitably, there's some guy that pulls out round them, accelerates, and is now on target. I bet they don't show up in the stats, do they?
Right. Right. I believe you're correct that there are potentially some crashes that aren't reported.
Wait, these are not crashes. These are near misses.
Correct.
They don't show up in the stats, do they?
That's correct.
Let me ask you another technical question. which I love this stuff, the SWITRS data is slightly different from the level of data reported by the Santa Monica Police Department, correct? They don't go as deep. Is that correct?
Correct.
So, in terms of crashes, what data are we going to use as our baseline? The COPS or the SWITRS?
So I think the SWITRS data is very helpful at identifying high-level trends. And what the police reports are very good at is for us to understand the circumstances that were involved in those individual crashes and what some of the contributing factors might have been that led to that crash. And what we are doing is we're using the police reports because they provide basically location and lane position information. So we know down to the lane that they were in, whether they were in the left turn lane headed eastbound, and we know how many vehicles were involved, and we have statements from the various motorists that were involved in those crashes so we can understand what happened. Realizing that there are 55 intersections along the corridor, I think what the goal is to develop collision diagrams along the corridor to start to identify where there are clusters of crashes. And those are the clusters that we want to really focus in on to understand why are there clusters of crashes and are there things that we can do to help deter those crashes from happening. I think that's where the crash data is very effective. But where it might not be effective is where we might have those near miss locations. And so I think that's where things like our interactive map or other community outreach opportunities that we're doing, we're asking folks to say, okay, we have this map that we've identified as a priority network that has the 4 locations and the blue lines on it. What are we missing? Are there other locations or challenges that you have out there during different times of the day that we should be aware of that we can go investigate and try to determine what to do? Because I agree, I think some of these unsignalized locations, I think when the volumes are very low, they're not that hard to take a left turn or walk across. But when it gets busy, there's a lot more conflicts at hand and a lot more things that people have to look at as they navigate through those locations.
Especially in the half-light, which happens around the twilight area.
Yeah.
So I guess what drives my concern is that, yes, there's the odd bike. We don't have adequate bike routes either side of Wilshire. So California is not, for example, doesn't have a bike lane all the way up there. You're encouraged to do that. Washington's been targeted for some bike boulevard treatment. You've got Broadway, which is an alternate route to the south, so that's okay, but Arizona is probably not as good as it should be, and it has these deep wells that you have to ride through. So there's some difficulty. So there's that. But we are trying to encourage this as a walking street, and yet when people seek to cross the road, that's where the problems come in. And you've talked about one community meeting. It's a very long road, 2.4 miles. Right. How are we going to make sure that people the length of this road that we're now trying to encourage them to come towards and use as a shopping destination or a retailer will participate? Because I bet there's 1,000 people out there in the community with stories about near misses on that road, won't go near it, don't walk down there.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's our goal. And so that's why we've chosen a variety of different outreach tools, such as the banners. Our hope is that people see the banners. They've been up now for about 2.5 weeks that link you to the website, let people know that there is a study that's going on. So that'll help capture some folks that might be traveling in that work here. Like I said, we've sent out about 13,000 mailers to everyone on the corridor, both landowners, property owners, business owners, and residents along the corridor. And we have reached out to some of the major employers and schools along the corridor to try to ask them to help us spread the word the best that we can, including going to the neighborhood groups. Because I realize you're right. There are people that come here for one day, people that might commute here, and it's always hard to capture everyone.
I don't want to interrupt you, but can I put it to you? I live on 5th Street, 2 blocks from Wilshire. I'm a member of the Planning Commission, fairly heavily involved in this community, almost obsessive about bike and safety. This is the first time I've heard about it.
Right.
So I bet there's 89,000 other people in this city who've heard even less. So that's a striking problem for communication for you. One last question from me before the rest go. You indicated unsafe speed as one of the issues. What does unsafe speed mean to you in this context?
So some of the crashes that are reported, ultimately they have to come up with a contributing factor of what led to the crash. And in some cases, these people were driving excessively fast. In some cases, they were driving fast and hit fixed
that's what I'm trying to get
roadway.
at. When you say that, does that mean they were driving at 25 miles an hour and when they should have been 10, or is it 60? What does that mean?
Right. Please, Nat.
Yeah, unsafe speed is a box on the police reports, for crash reports, and it can be up to the officer's discretion for unsafe speed depending on the condition of the crash. So oftentimes it'll be checked when someone is going 60 miles an hour straight on a street that is 35 miles an hour, but it may also be checked when someone takes a turn at 30 miles an hour, and it should be a turn at 15 miles an hour. So that's, again, why that data is important for the systemic understanding, because that's how the SWITRS data is coded. But then to really understand, was it that straight movement or that turning movement, we rely on the detailed police reports, because that will have the more nuanced information to help us get to the bottom of your question.
Thank you.
Okay, Leslie.
I just have two short questions, responses. One is after what happened at last week's Planning Commission meeting, which you, fortunately for you, were not here. I would strongly recommend that you notify all the community organizations in Santa Monica about what you're doing. We all use Wilshire. I mean, I don't live near it, but I certainly use it a lot. My vet's on Wilshire. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why I'm on Wilshire. I strongly recommend that you include, not necessarily have a meeting there, but Friends of Sunset Park, Ocean Park, all the others. Pico.
Well, luckily we have the president of Wilshire, Montana sitting right there. So
Well,
you can have that
but they're
discussion.
part of it. They're in the study area. Well, there you go.
And she
but-
stormed down here this evening.
Okay,
just for this purpose.
Okay, here, that's my very, very strong recommendation that you include all the community organizations in Santa Monica. The other thing I want to say is I'm sure the Planning Commission would be more than happy to host a community meeting other than the one on June 9th, if for no other reason so that more than 3 of us could be there.
Okay, Sean.
So thank you. Everything they said. I have a question about the bike. Well, I have a few questions, but I'll start with the bike collisions. And I understand Wilshire is not a biking street, but I do think it could be helpful to understand the bike collisions that have occurred. Why? Were they crossing Wilshire? Were they turning? Were there right-of-way conflicts? I think it could be very helpful to understand that. I know, for instance, that until very recently, when Performance Bike closed, of which I was a customer, I would bike up to Wilshire and then have to make some choices about how I was going to get with my bike into the shop. And so I virtually done everything. Biked up the alley, biked on Wilshire, made a left turn across the median, come up right, walked my bike on the sidewalk, whatever it was. And so it would be very helpful, I think, to understand what these causes were. So I just encourage you to do that moving forward. Your age ranges, 0 to 24 seems extremely broad. Particularly since people who are 0 to, let's say, 12, statistically speaking, tend to be a lot shorter and a lot less visible than people who are, say, 12 to 24. And people who are over 21 have more rights to imbibe the kinds of things that make them make bad choices than people who are under 21. I have no illusions that it doesn't happen among other folks, but would you consider breaking that out a little bit, just so that we can understand safety among different populations?
Absolutely.
That'd be very helpful. I echo Commissioner Lambert's recommendations regarding outreach. I'll just list a few. We have a couple of, I think if we host a public meeting, I think it could be very helpful to make sure that the commissions certainly on seniors and disability are invited, potentially also the Commission on the Status of Women in terms of different kinds of safety and visibility issues. Santa Monica spoke. There's also the emerging, the Safe Streets Alliance has access to some of the pedestrian activist organizations. It would be very helpful to notify the school district. I don't know if there are any schools for which crossing Wilshire is required to get to school. I tend to think not, but
Yeah, we have been in touch with Santa Monica Malibu School District,
Okay.
and they are aware of the study. The one school that has been identified as having a key crossing location is Lincoln School.
Okay.
Particularly 16th
Right.
Street, which we're going to take a close look at.
Okay. Congregations I didn't see on your list. There are churches, synagogues, folks who regularly walk to services at different days and times for different reasons, and I think that could be helpful, especially given the number of houses of worship, both on Wilshire itself and also on the north and south streets, St. Paul's, the Unitarian Church, obviously St. Monica's. There are some Chabad synagogues, all of which you're going to have people moving around. I think it would be helpful to notify them. To Commissioner McKinnon's point about people who work, I wonder whether you would have an opportunity to do some outreach to Big Blue Bus riders in some more either ads on the buses, in the buses, or maybe to the extent that there's emails or addresses that you could do a blast to people who are tap card holders, pass holders, things like that, to notify them of this. That'd be very helpful. And then lastly, and this goes to the questions about, wow, this is a really long street. If we can go back to the Harvard intersection. So that, I think, and the head of the public meetings, it would be really good to know what certainly the darker circles are, but I would point out that we did, a little to the east of that, there's new housing going in there. I don't know that someone who lives in that neighborhood is necessarily going to think of themselves as living on the same street as someone who lives, say, where Commissioner McKinnon lives. So really making sure that there's targeted outreach, and particularly targeted outreach that communicates that we're thinking about what people assume is not thought about, right? So you have a circle that is it's not a priority intersection, it's not even signalized. It's a place where in the lived experience there's probably a lot going on, but they assume that nobody knows about it because it's not happening there's no signal, there's no data. So I love the map that you've added, and I've seen it now posted in my school site. I'm in the Sunset Park area, but parents are posting and say, hey, use this. But I really want to encourage you to think more about the how you highlight some of those less obvious areas that people are experiencing significant difficulties with.
Thank you.
And thank you, Commissioner. Just one note, just so you all are aware, is we are actively engaging the Santa Monica Safe Streets Alliance to help get the word out. They're part of this project team. We recognize that's really great work happening already in the community.
Okay. Jason.
Thank you for coming tonight and talking to us about these important issues. First of all, I want to welcome your suggestion that this commission work with you through your process, and in fact I would volunteer the commission's time for the next 6 months, however much you need it.
Yeah.
And that might sound generous, but it's not.
He's leaving, of course. Thank you, Commissioner Perry.
Thank you.
So, you in your presentation, there seems to be a focus on severe injuries, which makes sense in that Vision Zero has a focus on severe injuries. But the question occurs to me with traffic collisions, the difference between a severe injury and a minor injury and a near miss is really a matter of a few inches sometimes. And to what extent is particularly when we're looking at relatively small numbers compared to other places in the world where accidents are just much more frequent and the patterns jump out much more clearly. To what extent do we need to be focusing, or should we be focusing on the severe injuries, and to what extent are we just looking at where there's general negative activity?
Yeah, I think I'll briefly say, and I might add to it as well. I think you're right, and I think that's why we're looking at all the crashes when we look at the police records, because every data point helps us kind of identify, is there cluster areas where it wasn't just a one-off crash, where there might be some repeatable thing going on there that we might be able to address through engineering design. So I agree. Every data point we can get, whether it's from a community member that lets us know of a particular issue, or whether we look at property damage only crashes, they're helpful to doing that. I think ultimately we want to make the streets safer so that we can get this line off the map. We don't want to see any more severe injury or fatal crashes on this or any other corridor for that part. And I think that if we identify what is the highest risk factors out there, if we can find ways to make the corridor more predictable and safer, then hopefully we can bring those numbers down.
Yeah, and I'll just note, if I may, Joe.
Yes. Sure.
You're absolutely right. Every crash is important, right? The fatal and severe injury crashes help understand the initial trends to investigate further, but this diagram maps every crash: property damage only, minor injury, severe injury, fatality, right?
So it's a gateway into the closer look.
That's exactly
Got
right.
it.
Yeah, and it's an important part of the process, right? You start big picture and then you zero in, and that's why we can't overemphasize these diagrams will be our roadmap to understanding what's happening, and it involves whether a vehicle hit a bike rack, right? Property damage only, versus something really severe that happens.
But if there were an intersection that had a high number of incidents and not necessarily severe injuries, you would be looking at that as well.
That's right. That's
Got it.
correct.
Okay. Thank you for addressing that. And one of the slides that you had there, I believe, when you were reviewing the preliminary findings, there was some language I wanted to ask you to expand on. I believe it was potential conflicts with median. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I'll start for sure. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, please.
Again, these are just some of the themes that we've heard. Key stakeholders, again, this could come from some of the meetings we've had at neighborhood associations or institutional stakeholders like police and fire. And so what we've heard, the median has been in the ground since about 2003. And so folks who've been working in the community since before and after that have expressed some questions about whether or not it's improved safety. So that's just one of our initial investigation points to know, all right, looking at all the crashes, how many are actually happening at the median? And then of those, what is actually causing those crashes? So we still, again, this is just a theme that we've heard. We can't, make any recommendations based on it yet, but something worth investigating.
Then the potential scope of recommendations goes from changing striping to potentially installing roundabouts in certain. There's like no limit to the range that you'll be considering. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think also knowing that it is a massive corridor, and we do try to intend to develop countermeasures that are tied to specific safety issues. Mm-hmm. I don't see this as an entire corridor redesign. Rather, what we'd like to try to get this down to is, there could be systematic treatments that we do up and down the corridor, such as signage and markings that make things more predictable and more uniform, and that could be a corridor-wide type treatment or corridor-wide lighting upgrades if there is a safety issue tied to it. But I think the individual locations is where we'll really have to spend a lot of time identifying what types of solutions might be best, whether it's a roundabout or extension of a median or restrictions on certain turn maneuvers to reduce conflict points. I think we just don't know yet until we narrow down those kind of hot spots.
Right. I understand that the answers will reveal themselves as you go through the process, and I just would urge you to not feel limited by existing funding or other dynamics, including could we look at a street-wide solution, to put those ideas out there, and then whatever can be paid for can be paid for. But again, thank you for coming tonight.
Yeah, no, thank you for having us.
I had a couple more questions. Was there any reference to scooters in your crash data and analysis?
Yeah, so great question. It's definitely something we're interested in looking at. And What we've discovered is, so the short answer is no. In what we've seen, there is no indication of scooter crashes. That being said, how they have been categorized has been inconsistent. And so moving forward, we understand that there is now a way for the police department to categorize a crash involving a scooter. And so that is something that we're certainly paying attention to.
So I have 2 points following on from that. One, the simple volume of cross traffic, whether it's scooters or pedestrians or bikes or whatever else, at certain locations may lead to higher incidents. Second, the scooter thing is a scooter may provoke incredible road rage in a car driver that results in a crash further up. And we all live in Santa Monica, so we know to avoid that strip of road if you're riding a bike, unless you have to go there. Visitors and people who are in offices tend not to. So they're the least well equipped to be on that piece of road. So that in itself poses some problems. I mean, you see people get on a share bike and off they go, or a Lime bike. These are really risky behaviours. You can't capture that, so how will you deal with that phenomena?
Yeah, so again, there is a big data capture part of this effort as well, where we're looking at different movements along the corridor, different volumes, speed of vehicles. And so we are actually also collecting scooter movements to understand, trends.
Directly from Bird?
No, sorry. We have a data collection contractor who goes out and literally tallies.
But they have a contract with the city which says they have to tell us the statistics.
Yeah, so, right, so I think there's two different things at hand. So there's the shared mobility pilot program, which is ongoing. We are coordinating with the shared mobility folks to understand where the incidents have been and where the major activity of these scooters are. For the most part, my understanding is there's a heavy concentration in the downtown area for the scooters. We don't see as many that go up Wilshire. No. We are also supplementing that information for our own study by doing detailed turning movement counts. So we go out and we count vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles, and scooters. And we're getting that information sort of by block segment to get an understand of what types of volumes are we dealing with out there, of how prevalent are scooter activities out there. We have heard comments from the community about people, whether they're riding on the sidewalk or in the roadway, but just trying to grapple with how much of a problem is it out there.
So I'm not the anti-scooter brigade. I think they are a very important part of our mobility here. It's just we don't want them to be causing crashes nor to be part of the crash problem. Overall, thank you very much. Whatever we can do to help deal with this and make Wilshire a destination for people walking and in the city would be a great thing. So call on us at any time, particularly Commissioner Landis.
So I actually had a couple of other, just to Commissioner McKinnon's point, we have that data for as long as some state legislation that has been proposed does not pass. There is pending state legislation that would actually eviscerate our ability to collect data from the shared mobility folks. So I just make that observation, which would, I won't editorialize, though my feelings should be obvious. Are you I think, again, this goes to the communications question, but it also goes to the way you're moving this forward. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of my questions are coming from my experience with the Sunset Park traffic study and the outreach that's happened and the, what's working and what's not working. Will you be communicating to the public how other models have succeeded? I'm thinking, for example, there was a project on Western in the city of LA, I think it was led by LA Moss, that was actually doing a pilot project, a very long stretch of Western. They were also doing some work, I think, on West Adams. I think when we're asking the public to imagine what could be different, it could be helpful to say, well, in other cities, whether it's here in the county or elsewhere across the country, here's some examples of how this kind of a streetscape intervention has changed, right? And it's good for you on the research side, but it's also good for the public to be able to envision it. Will you be looking at those, talking about those?
At some point in the process, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think at the first community workshop, the intent is really to focus on the data and make sure that we're not missing any holes in our data collection observations.
Right.
But I think as we get through, I agree. I think that's where we want to start understanding what the toolbox might be, so that people can kind of start seeing that.
Okay.
Knowing that ultimately we're driving to this second community meeting with sort of alternative type treatments that we might be able to deploy.
Okay. I would add grocery stores to the list of places to do some spot on outreach. The Ralph's, the Whole Foods.
We do have some targeted outreach. I know that we are going to have folks stationed out in front of Whole Foods around lunchtime, handing out flyers. That was one of the targeted locations. We did have folks handing out information at Bike to Work Week just last week, so to try to get different subsets of people at different times. But thank you.
Right. When they do free donuts at Krispy Kreme, that's a good line to go talk to.
Which day is that?
Last question, I promise. Yeah. Can you, because this has come up so many times, can we go back to that crash slide? Can you just walk us through it? Because just tell us what's on this slide. Give us your read of that slide, just so we and the public can have an understanding of what you get from this.
Yeah, sure. So again, this is one intersection looking at every crash that happened over a 3-year period. And the red arrows are the at-fault party. And then it's a little hard to read, but then the data points are also coded based on whether it was nighttime crash or a severe crash.
And just say more about just literally
so
tell us what's happening.
Totally. What we see here is a lot of crashes happening actually at the intersection, right? So if I showed you a different collision diagram, you see some of them are more spread out, right? Things that are happening approaching or exiting the intersection. So here we see a lot of concentration in the middle of the intersection, a lot of turning movements, right? I see a couple different left turns. There is a median crash that happens. There are some very detailed indicators of an out of control crash, right? So that indicates that somebody maybe hit something and then lost control of the vehicle. Right. That's the one that you see. It sort of looks like a hockey stick. And then we see some rear end and broadside. Again, the lines that are actually going across Wilshire indicate that there is a lot of activity of, again, whether it's somebody crossing or somebody making a turning movement and a vehicle causing a crash, right? So I would say the short takeaway, right, after that long explanation, is a lot of activity actually at the intersection, whether that's a person walking, biking, driving. There's conflict there.
I just have one quick question, I promise. I think it might be useful, because 11th and Wilshire seems to be a real hot spot of bad stuff, bad activities, that you look at the correlation between collisions and alcohol service. Because I know 2 of the corners at 11th and Wilshire both serve alcohol. One is a bar exclusively, the other is a restaurant with a bar. And if there is a correlation, it would be good to know what that is. And there appears to be at 11th and Wilshire.
So I have a couple of quick questions. So when you look at that, the diagram with the red dots and the shading showing intensity of activity or crashes, and you led us to believe that the flow on Wilshire is constant once you get east of Lincoln. Was that an accurate representation?
Well, I think the diagram that's shown there is showing daily through volumes on Wilshire. So I think what that diagram does not maybe accurately show is that I think what I suspect is on the western section where it's blue, the through volume might be low. However, the side street activity picks up. You have a lot of cross volume because of the downtown location, and you have a lot of different cross patterns. So there might actually be more conflicts at that location. Mm-hmm. So I think that's sort of the next step where we want to head with this, is start to normalize some of the data to really understand what is the rate of occurrence that's happening at these different locations. Because as you get down to the eastern part, there are some quiet side streets where you don't have a lot of cross volume, but you have very heavy throughput where you might have some congestion that could lead to frustration or other factors.
Right. So when I look at that diagram back to the original one that had the red dots, that is a very lumpy diagram, and I assume when you come back to us a year from now, you'll be able to explain every one of those lumps. That's the liquor store lump. That's the school crossing lump. That's the whatever. Is that something we can expect of that fine grained understanding of explaining why things are the way they are?
I hope so, and I think that not every crash can be explained. And I think that we're seeing a lot of different types of ones. A lot of things, there are DUIs that are being reported. People that are fixed collisions, they're hitting the median because they were driving under the influence. So there are those types of crashes that are out there. And I don't know that we're going to be able to come up with targeted countermeasures for every crash that happens on a corridor.
No, obviously we can't.
But what I do hope is that we can try to identify where are the hot spots, where we can come up with really targeted countermeasures to help reduce the occurrence of these crashes, and other systematic changes along the corridor help make it more predictable and just generally safer.
Right. But if you run the experiment long enough, eventually the data flattens out. You're not getting all these jaggy things.
Yep.
And so one experiment that we've performed on the unsuspecting public is 2003. We filled the street with medians. And yet today, we don't seem to be able to tell if that experiment worked. In other words, do you have data pre-2003 to say, yep, it was a great success, we cut the death rate by 1 a year, choose a number. How, you know what I'm saying, we do these experiments, but then we don't have enough before and after to measure this. I'm a little surprised we're still discussing this medium. I think it's a fascinating topic, and it may be the source of problems or solution to problems, but we should be able to sort that out.
What I will say is that when we looked at this intersection, crashes by intersection type, what we are seeing is that most of the crashes are occurring in the intersections themselves. Before we did any analysis, I was under the impression that maybe we'd see a lot more mid-block, maybe at some of the alleyways or just mid-block locations, but it really does seem to be converging on the two-way stop controlled and signalized locations, and we're just not seeing as many mid-block, which might be attributed to a median crash. I don't know that we know the full answer of what has happened now that those are in, and I think we will look into it a lot more closely, but I'm just not seeing so far that is the major contributing factor to things that we're seeing out there.
Okay. And so when you look at, for instance, this one here, it seems the percentages are the same, whether you are in a signalized intersection or in a two-way stop intersection. The ratio of the kinds of accidents are the same. Does that surprise you?
I think the split by total is similar, because I believe there is 18 signalized and 17 two-way stop controlled intersections roughly along the corridor, and so it makes sense that they're about equal. However, the side street volumes are typically a lot lower on those two-way stop control locations, which means the rate of crashes could potentially be higher. And so I think that's where we're headed next, is to really understand, is there actually a higher incidence at some of these locations, and are there really targeted locations we have to look at? Because at the unsignalized locations, I know that when you go out there in low volume conditions, it's very easy to take a left, but it's a lot more challenging when it's busy. And I think that's being reflected in some of the reports that we're reading out there, where people are saying, I thought it was clear, and I made it halfway across, and it wasn't.
Got it. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. We do. So thank you. And now we're ready for public comment. Anyone who wants to make public comment, be sure to turn in a chit, that little piece of paper, to the secretary. And write fast.
Why don't we just call her? Excuse me, microphone.
Yeah.
Nice meeting you. Hi. Thank you very much for letting me speak. I didn't think there was public comment. I apologize. I apologize to the clerk as well. My name is Elizabeth Vandenberg. I live in Wilmont, which is the Wilshire, Montana Neighborhood Coalition. I am the chair this year, proudly, and we are very excited about this project. We want to provide a lot of input. We do have a lot of input. We have a ton of things that hit Wilshire, everything from the large hotels to kids crossing the street for St. Monica's. So I do hope that the comments that the Planning Commission says goes to the staff. We're pretty focused on 2nd Street. We'd be very interested to know what goes on there. and really understand how the crossings, we go from Ocean all the way to 21st Court, so we really have the bulk of this, and we work heavily with Northeast Neighbor on Wilshire issues. So we really look forward for resident voice. We so appreciate the Commission's input to the consultants that were important, and we are, and I will get the word out tonight to my groups, to everybody I can. I'd like to be able to understand how to work better with Safe Streets and some of those other organizations. We aren't aware how to communicate with them or how to contact them, really, so anything that you could help us with to understand that, we would like to coordinate that. So thank you very much for the time.
I just have a quick question,
Yeah.
if that's right. Because you mentioned 2nd Street, and it occurred to me that we hadn't heard a word about scramble intersections, and I wondered whether what your experience had been with them.
I think I'll let the residents speak. I mean, I'm not a big fan personally, but that's not the point. The point is to hear from everybody. So I think we'll let that fall out as it does. It's in place. It's been in place for a while now, and I think we'll get comments. I still some people messing up, but I think they're tourists. I mean, they just don't know, and they don't understand. Okay, and I am very interested in 11th Street as well. I appreciate the commissioner's comment on that. Thank you very much.
Okay. That closes the public testimony. Any discussion? Hearing none, we're going to close this item. And well, actually, let me ask you a question. Did you get what you needed from us?
Yes, I think so. Thank you for having us. I think this has been really helpful discussion.
Do we need do you need a direction to staff motion for the yes, we want to have a meeting?
I think that was picked up during the
Okay.
conversation.
Great.
I suggest that we move on as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're on to item 8A, which is 156 Fraser, the variance 19 ENT 0036. And let's have ex parte communications.
Hold on. I have to get my list.
I could start. You go.
All right.
Well, snooze and you lose.
Don't you want to know? Does this? Okay. I spoke on the telephone on Monday to Lucia Baskauskas and her husband Stephen Anaya in one long phone call where we discussed the process that this application had been through, as well as various details of Ocean Park history and how to pronounce Ms. Baskauskas' name. I spoke to Mary Marlowe, who called me on the telephone this morning, and she told me the things she was concerned about, which were outlined in her letter. I spoke to Ruth Ann Lehrer at one point today about the possible retention of integrity of the original part of the structure. I got an email from Susan Cloak asking me what I thought about it, and I responded asking her what she thought. I visited the site on Sunday afternoon and again on Tuesday afternoon, and those are all the many things I've done besides the public letters that we've all received.
I tried to visit the site today, but the torrential downpour, I didn't. And then I tried on the way to, well, at any rate, I did not. I've communicated several times with Ruth Ann Lehrer today about the LA Conservancy's support for this project, subject to one condition. And I've read all the mail that I've gotten on about the project.
So I received a blind copy email, which I think we all may have received, but it wasn't addressed to me directly, requesting a meeting with the architect, but didn't. Did we all get those? I didn't reply. I had a call last night at 6:30 with Mary Marlowe regarding the property and the concerns that she outlined in her letter. And this afternoon at about 5:45, I drove up to the street and then did a walk around on at Fraser, and then walking around Nielsen Way and around to Ocean Park, and observed the property as well as observed the back side of the property from Nielsen Way.
I took a call from Mary Marlow at 3 o'clock yesterday. We spoke for about 10 minutes. I spoke to the owner of the property a couple of minutes ago in the bathroom, and that's about it. He's incredibly persuasive under those circumstances. Trust me, I would have agreed to anything he said.
I spoke with the applicant this morning for about 10 minutes. He discussed the reasons behind the requests. I too intended and tried to go this afternoon and was not able to, but I was on the commission when we heard other requests on this street, and I'm quite familiar with the street.
And I spoke to Ruth Ann, Mary Marlowe, Lucia, and visited the site on Sunday. So, Ross, the floor is yours.
And may I also just say that I'm going to have to leave at 9:15, so I may make some comments before I go if necessary, but otherwise, I'm sure you'll do the right thing.
That happens every night.
He said something about bikes.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ross Furman, and I'm an Associate Planner with the City Planning Division. The request before you is 19 ENT 0036, a request for 2 variances for the property located at 156 Fraser Avenue. Specifically, the 2 variance requests are for the addition of a 3rd story and a reduction of the required parking from 2 spaces to 0. The subject property is located in the medium density residential or R2 zone district on the south side of Fraser Avenue, 2 parcels west of Nielsen Way. The parcel is approximately 27.5 feet wide by 94 feet in depth and approximately 2,608 square feet in size, and is surrounded by residential on all sides. Prior to the zoning ordinance update in 2015, this area was zoned R2R, which had specific standards for the area. While it is not called R2R any longer, the same development criteria still exists for the specific area of R2. The existing site was developed in 1910 as a multi-unit residential project with 2 separate dwelling units on site with no parking. The existing front dwelling is 1,166 square feet and is designed in the Craftsman style with a 999 square foot main floor and a 167 square foot mostly subterranean level. In regards to the rear unit, in July 2018, the structure was approved for demolition by the city's Landmarks Commission, having gone through the required 75-day waiting period. Additionally, the subject property has been removed from the rental market, having gone through the Ellis Act process and approved granted in August 2018. It is also important to note that the site is listed on the city's historic resource inventory as both individually eligible for listing as a Santa Monica landmark and as a contributor to the potential South Beach Residential Historic District, one of only 7 properties in the potential district with dual significance. One important thing to note is how the city's definition of a basement affects the existing structure. For a basement to not be considered a story, it must adhere to the following 2 requirements. The basement must not project more than 3 feet above average natural grade, and no more than 40% of each basement elevation may be exposed above finished grade. As the dwelling unit was built 3 feet 6 inches above A&G, the existing mostly subterranean level is considered a story because it projects 6 inches above the basement definition threshold. Therefore, the existing structure is looked at as a 2-story dwelling unit. The proposed scope of work includes the following: an 842 square foot addition to the existing 167 square foot first story for a total of 1,009 square feet, a 31 square foot addition to the existing 999 square foot second story for a total of 1,030 square feet, and a 733 square feet addition of a new 3rd story. If approved, these additions would increase the existing 1,166 square foot dwelling unit to 2,772 square feet. Additionally, a new 252 square foot covered back porch, a 27 square foot second floor front covered balcony, and a 235 square foot rear roof deck are proposed. In regards to the roof deck, an accessory stairway is proposed that projects approximately 5 feet above the roof line. Pursuant to the height exception section of the municipal code, a stairwell is permitted to project 14 feet above the roof line. As mentioned previously, 2 variance requests are proposed. The first request is for the addition of a third story. As described earlier, the existing house is considered a two-story dwelling due to the mostly subterranean level being considered a story due to the definition of a basement. Because of this pre-existing condition, the applicant is requesting approval of a 733 square foot third story. If approved, the height of the dwelling will be 28 feet high, which is 2 feet below the 30-foot height limit for the district. The third story has been positioned 3 feet behind the roof line of the existing second story in order to keep intact the front facade character defining features such as the front porch and existing roof design. As for the second variance request, the applicant is requesting a reduction of required parking. It is important to note that no parking currently exists on site. The reason for this request is that pursuant to the parking section of the municipal code, if 50% or more square footage is added to the principal building, parking must be updated to current standards. The existing house is 1,166 square feet, and the proposed project will result in an addition of 1,606 square feet, which is over the 50%. Therefore, the applicant is required to provide 2 new parking spaces. However, due to the size of the lot and the siting of the existing dwelling, parking is not able to be accommodated without demolishing portions of the structure. In order for this requirement to not be triggered, the applicant would only be allowed to add 582 square feet. It's also important to note that because of the removal of the rear unit, parking demand has actually decreased for the property. As previously mentioned, the subject property is located within the potential South Beach Residential Historic District that is bounded by Nielsen Way to the east, Ocean Park to the south, Bernard Way to the west, and Wadsworth to the north. Of the 103 properties in the potential district, 60 are contributors and 43 are non-contributors, with 7 properties within the district identified as both contributors and individually eligible resources. As mentioned, the subject property is one of those 7. The potential district is exclusively residential in its development, primarily with 1- and 2-story single-unit dwellings with a blend of architectural styles, along with a small number of multi-unit buildings. Common characteristics include minimum front and side setbacks, with eaves of neighboring houses almost touching in some instances, medium-pitched gable and hipped roofs, wide open eaves, front porches, sometimes enclosed, and a variety of cladding materials. Common alterations include the replacement of original doors and windows, the addition of front porches, decks, and balconies, and upper story and rear 2-story additions. 10 findings are required for approval, such as are there special circumstances or exceptional characteristics applicable to the property. The strict application of the provisions of this ordinance would result in practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships. The variance would not impair the integrity and character of the district in which it is located, and the strict application of the provisions of the ordinance result in unreasonable deprivation of the use and enjoyment of the property. The proposed addition of the third story is only due to the existing structure's mostly subterranean lower level, not complying with the current definition of a basement. If not for the pre-existing conditions that predate this definition, the proposed third story would not have needed to come before you tonight because it would not have been considered a third story. The proposed scope of work would retain the structure's character-defining features, such as the craftsman vernacular and the front porch, and maintain a 1-story appearance at the front of the dwelling as the new story is set back behind the existing roof line. The addition would also be consistent with common alterations of the district. If approved, this addition would allow the subject property to be used in the same way as other properties on the block who have 2 habitable above grade stories. They may also have a third semi-subterranean level, but was constructed prior to the current definition of a basement. In regards to the parking variance, due to the addition being over the 50% threshold of the existing structure's square footage, parking is required to be brought to current code, which is 2 spaces. As the home was built in 1910, parking was not a requirement and therefore no parking exists currently, and as such, without demolition of the portions of the structure, parking cannot be accommodated. The reduction of the parking to 0 spaces would not result in adverse effect on the subject property or neighborhood, as the current parcel does not provide parking on site, and the project is an enlargement of an existing single-unit dwelling as opposed to the addition of new units. As this requirement is more this requirement is more burdensome to smaller dwellings in comparison to larger ones, as it limits potential growth. Ultimately, if approved, these variances would allow the existing structure to adapt to modern needs while maintaining the historic integrity of this structure in the neighborhood. And it should be noted that although single-unit dwellings are generally exempt from architectural review, the proposed project is located in an area of the city that requires all structures to be reviewed and approved by the ARB. Per usual, notices were mailed to the surrounding property owners within 750-foot radius, and it was advertised in the Santa Monica Daily Press. Staff received 17 comment letters, 5 were in support, and 12 were in opposition. The opposition letters stated concerns regarding privacy due to the upper story outdoor space, such as the roof deck, parking, and lastly, the impact that the third story addition has on the existing structure and the neighborhood as a whole. All comment letters have been provided to you for your review. In conclusion, staff recommends to approve the variance 19 ENT 0036 based on the findings and subject to the conditions outlined in the staff report and the draft statement of official actions. That completes my presentation, and both I and the applicant are here to answer any of your questions.
Okay, are there any questions for staff?
Should we do it now?
Actually,
Just quickly?
let's delay it. 'Cause
Okay, let's
we
do
can
that.
Could I
grant-
suggest we take the public comment, especially
Okay.
the lady?
Yeah, we're going to interrupt our normal flow and take the Well, I'm saying, let me finish my sentence. You guys jump into the thing. So we'll hear from the applicant, and then I'd like to bring up the first person with the children as our first public testimony. So can we have the applicant? You have 15 minutes, of which you may allocate some at the end after public testimony.
Hold on one second.
You don't have to take up your entire 15 minutes if you don't want.
I'll try not to.
So you should just be able to hit the right left.
Oh, okay.
We can, yeah, because they'll come back. You know.
Good evening. I'm Chris Stage. I'm the architect on this project. And thanks, Ross, for that recap. I just want to kind of dive in. But basically, bottom line, what we're asking for is a variance that would allow us to have a basement, and then a variance which would allow us to keep the current existing condition of no on-site parking. I'll try to keep this short, but I'll just give a brief intro to the property and then talk about why what we're proposing is in keeping with the character of the neighborhood, and then discuss why the variances are required to avoid depriving the property owner of what neighboring properties are able to enjoy. So as Ross said, the property is 156 Fraser. It's a street primarily of 2- and 3-story homes. As you can see at the upper photos, just shows some of the character. I know a lot of you have already gone to the street. 18 out of the 28 houses on the street are at least 2 stories. Many have 3-story facades. So I think when all of us think of Ocean Park, we kind of have this nostalgic vision of these single-story bungalows, but the reality is quite different. So these 4 blocks of Ocean Park, obviously, and this street in particular, feature a lot of historic homes from the early 1900s. This house was built in 1910, a little bit later than many of the surrounding homes. Currently, as Ross said, there's about 1,000 square feet. It has 2 small bedrooms and 1.5 bathrooms. The defining features of this property, as seen in the lower left image, include the low-pitched roof, the shed dormer, and a clinker brick, they call it, front porch and piers. The clients love this house and the surrounding neighborhood because of the historic charm. They're drawn to the historic nature of the house, and they've restored historic homes in the past. We'd like to create the home that they will retire in, with space for kids and grandkids to gather, and the variances are required to make that happen. Maintaining the historic nature of the property has been a key driver in this design process. during which we've sought input from historic consultants, GPA Consulting, as well as from Santa Monica planning staff. Both variances being requested are a direct result of trying to maintain the historic nature of the facade for the benefit of the neighborhood while still being able to use the property in substantially the same way that neighboring properties are currently being utilized. Now, I just want to quickly go through the immediately surrounding properties just to provide some context. So we'll look at properties right next door as well as 2 doors away. First, 159 Fraser, it's diagonally across the street, 2,800 square feet, 4 beds, 4 baths. Next door to that, 157, 2,300 square feet, 5 beds, 3 baths. 153, 2,100 square feet, 3 and 4. And then 151 Fraser, 3,480 square feet, 7 beds, 2 baths. Next, we have immediately next door to the subject property, 158 Fraser, 2,240 square feet, 3 beds, 2 baths. And then next door on the other side, 154, 1,870 square feet, 2 bed, 1 bath. Then 150, 1,564 square feet, 5 beds, 2 baths. Immediately behind the property, there's an apartment building on the corner of Ocean Park, 2-story, 161 Ocean Park, 3,300 square feet, 6 beds, 5 baths. And then we have 155 and 157 Ocean Park condos, each 3,580 square feet, 4 beds, 3 baths. And then 149 Ocean Park, 3,000 square feet. So looking at all of these properties, the immediate context, we see the average square footage is 2,720. They average 4.2 bedrooms and about 3 bathrooms. Our existing project is 1,000 square feet, 2 beds, 1 bath, and what we're proposing would bring it up to 2,772, so right in line with the immediate context. Again, as Ross said, it's important to note that 1,000 square feet of that would be below grade in a basement, so it has no visual impact on the surrounding neighborhood. I think this summary demonstrates that what we're asking to be allowed to do is to utilize the property in substantially the same way that neighboring properties are currently being utilized. And as I mentioned earlier, if we zoom out a little bit, 18 out of the 28 houses on the street are already 2 or 3 stories. These are some of the other houses further down the street. So this shows the variance for number of stories would not detrimentally impact surrounding properties because what we're actually doing is becoming more in line with what's going on this street. So we've already established that we're asking to be able to utilize the property in the same way as surrounding properties. Now let's look at unique conditions to this property that necessitate the variances. The existing house takes up most of the entire lot width, and so in order to add parking, we'd have to elevate the house and place the garage below it. This has been done on 4 out of the 5 immediate neighbors around this property and was something that we looked at initially. We were hopeful about it, but after our initial studies, it was quickly obvious that doing so would ruin the historic nature of this front facade. The neighbors that have all done this all have wood porches. And in our case, the unique feature of the clinker brick porch and piers, these are specifically identified in the HRI as defining features of the house, are not able to be incorporated with the garage below and have it look integral to the historic structure. So the historic consultants we spoke with agreed that this was not a viable solution, and Santa Monica planning staff also informed us that this approach would not likely be approved for this particular home. Therefore, the only solution for parking is that we ask that we're able to maintain the status quo of no on-site parking. Now, the clients would obviously prefer to have a private garage, but our prioritization on maintaining the historic facade precludes that. So, as I touched on before, the lot currently has 2 units. So, if we go ahead with the proposal, we would be eliminating 1 unit and thereby freeing up 2 street parking spaces for the neighborhood. So we're not adding parking, but it's a net gain to the neighborhood in terms of parking. Next, I want to touch on why the variance for the added stories is needed. So we're proposing to add a second floor as allowed by code. It would have 8-foot ceilings, and the ceilings are 21'2" above grade. Again, it's, as Ross stated, it's well below the height limits for the neighborhood. So in an effort to minimize the visual impact, we made a conscious effort to push that second floor back beyond the ridge of the original house, thereby letting the original facade take center stage and be the main focal point of the house. This is in conformance with Secretary of State's recommendations for historic remodels and reuse. And we actually moved it even further back after meeting with Stephanie Reich. Oh, yeah. So this actually shows the addition at the back there. Thanks. But starting the addition this far back really limits the size of that second floor. We're at about 730 square feet up as proposed, and 1564 is what would be allowed by code. So because of this, we would like to also add the basement below, which, again, because of the definition of basement, has to count as a story. Thereby, we end up with the 3 floors. Again, it's important to note that this 3rd floor will have no visual impact on the neighborhood or surrounding neighbors. So I think this first rendering of the exterior shows it's taken from the corner of Nielsen and Fraser. And this angle sort of shows how dramatically set back that second floor addition is. You almost don't see it there, between the tree and the neighboring house. And then from more straight on, you see that it's set back. The roof forms are mimicking the original house. And this was something we did in consultation with the historic consultant and also Stephanie Reich's advice. The porch on the second floor provides some depth to that new facade and also mimics the shed dormer of the existing house below. The detailing and materials will all be very similar, but differentiated enough that it's obvious it was an addition as required by Secretary of Interior standards. So in conclusion, I think we've demonstrated the historic nature of the house presents special conditions that are unique to the property, and complying with the zoning ordinance would prevent us from utilizing the property in the same way that most neighboring properties are currently utilized. In addition, granting these 2 variances would not detrimentally impact the public or other residents. The variance to allow the basement will have no visual impact, and the variance to allow no on-site parking would maintain the existing condition and in fact result in the reduction in parking demand by eliminating 1 unit. So that's the end of my statements. The owner is here and would like to just say a few brief words if possible.
Okay.
So I'll be quick. Commissioners, staff, and neighbors, thank you for your time. My name is Jonathan Quincy Smith. Myself and my lovely bride are the sole owners of this. Just to set some ground rules, because you don't know me, I have a deep respect for historic things, all things historic. My stepfather was the head of New York State Historical Association for many years. I grew up in Cooperstown, New York. Oh, sorry. Deep respect for deep and healthy respect for historic things. My stepfather was the head of the New York State Historical Association for many years. I grew up on a farm in Cooperstown, New York that was settled in 1653. My wife and I have a house in Long Island that's been for 14 years. that we've owned that was built in 1706 and subject to historic there. And in San Francisco, where we live full-time for now, our house was built actually in 1894, survived the fire, and adhered to all historic standards and went above and beyond, I hope, and we would intend to here. My lovely bride and I met each other 6 miles north of here. We have a big fans of the neighborhood. Who couldn't be? They're all great, and I welcome healthy conversation throughout it, of course, as is not just the way of democracy, no matter how much it's been failing us recently. And welcome to all those. I just don't like the quote fake news, and I think you did a great job, Chris. But just to be clear, I saw some of those letters of why don't they do a parking lot or parking garage. I'd love to. If you guys think that we can get away with doing that with that facade, we'd have it in a second. Two, I do observe coming from the north that the ways of scooters, Ubers, and Lyfts are coming. We don't have as much need for cars anymore. We won't. We hope we don't. You mentioned grandchildren kindly. We'd love to see them there. And the only other thing that I meant that nobody had mentioned yet, but I just saw reference to, is time and preparation. Like this meeting was somehow surprised upon us all. The signage was out there for, I don't remember, May of last year. So we want to make sure that we have an open dialogue with all our friends today and tomorrow. So the object of that game is important. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the applicant? Yeah, wait, hold your questions to the end. Okay. Okay, so now we have public testimony. Could we have the lady with the children first?
Hi, I'm Justina Bishkauskas. I've seen some of you before. I've had my own variance application a couple of years ago. It was a slog, and I appreciate what you're going through, and I know it's tough work. Ross and Chris have been absolutely amazing, very intelligent, very kind with their time, answering questions, and really participating in the community dialogue. One of the things that I found a little bit discerning in this process was that there wasn't a neighborhood outreach quite in the beginning. I feel like we're all kind of catching up. Plans weren't distributed. There wasn't a neighborhood meeting, and our community is very much based on that, where everyone gets together and you kind of review what's going on. For my variance process, there was a neighborhood context study that was asked by Jing. I don't know if Roxanne doesn't do things that way. I know Jing is on maternity leave, but I would recommend that might be a good step to do a broader neighborhood context study of the neighborhood. I'm all about improvements. I've done them to my own home, and many neighbors have done them as well. I feel for this property, one of the big issues is the roof deck. It is not similar to neighboring properties. It's more Redondo Beach than Fraser Avenue. I feel that if the plans could be modified to potentially put a rear balcony off the master bedroom, that might be more suitable to the style of what is in our neighborhood. No neighboring properties have full basements or first stories, and if they do, they were done without variances. That might be another way that maybe we can reduce the footprint or the impact of the home. The parking is an issue on Fraser, and it will always be an issue. I have a home with no parking. I drive around constantly. I have kids, as you see. To lift the home, I don't know if that's feasible or not, but I know that Chris is massively intelligent. I know that Ross is a phenomenal planner. I know that Roxanne and Jing can meet, and perhaps they need a little bit more time to come up with a modified plan that addresses some of the neighborhood concerns and also gives this lovely family their retirement home. Thank you so much.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to call out a few names.
Yeah. I'm going to head out with my children. So is that all right? Or,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hillary Hoffman, followed by Lucia Bashkauskas, followed by Stefan Anaya. I'm saying, not Justina. This is Lu Chan.
Hi.
Okay. Hi.
So my name's Hillary Hoffman. I actually live at 154 Fraser, so I'm that window right there. And I actually came, I guess I wanted to say, first of all, that like Justina just said, we are a community on that street. We all know each other and love each other. We watch out for each other. Our kids all play together. We're all super, super close. So I guess I also just wanted to say that my husband and I and my 7-year-old son live next door, and although not excited to live through a construction project being next door, we also are in support of what they're trying to do. And from what the conversations that we've had, understanding the basement really isn't going to change the look of the house, and understanding they don't have parking now. So I guess I just wanted to come tonight just to say that, you know, I've had the conversations and feel like what they're doing is reasonable, and I understand what it's like to live in a tiny house with kids, and having space is a nice thing, so I just wanted to show my support.
Okay. Okay, Yuchija.
My name is Lucia Bashkauskas. I know it sounds like I don't speak English when people look at it, but I do. I have lived in Fraser Avenue with my family, of whom you have seen my daughter Justina and her 2 children, our grandchildren. And what I saw tonight was an incredible thing. What I did with my daughter, my husband and I did when we went to these meetings when she was exactly the same age as my eldest daughter, to create R2R. Later on, to pass out leaflets, to develop a community that was able to defend ourselves against 6 stories at the beach in the just south of us, in the huge project that the city proposed and we were opposed to, which led to myself and now deceased Bernice Marshall suing the city and stopping the project. So we have 2 stories at the beach instead of 6. We have worked on all the traffic patterns. We have discussed and worked on every tree in the park that we have developed together with the city. John Jalili, as you remember him. And furthermore, we have worked to have low-income housing across the street. We have worked for parking, which is metered parking at the beach for the people that come to watch the sunset rather than playing the full realm. We have worked our entire lives to develop this community and to maintain it. The problem is, and a big problem is, that I and others are alarmed that the structure that we formed with R2R is in fact not the structure that exists today. R2 as it exists today is not the same. R2 would never allow a roof porch with open barbecue pit, with open flames. It would never allow that. 2 stories with a pitched roof only if there were witches-like peaks that we hoped to maintain on Wadsworth. We tried our very best to integrate the neighborhood, being when people come and they look at the neighborhood, as was beautifully told by the architect, they look at comparisons and say, we want that. Well, they show you a picture of a rooming house that was built. They show you a picture of a house that was lifted during World War II or during the McDonnell Douglas. They show you a house that was before R2R. They show you a house when we lived in the neighborhood was the biggest drug house in the world that is now a beautiful looking house that we had thought so much to make that. And I feel that our neighborhood is being destroyed piecemeal. I feel that it's a battle, a hand-to-hand battle, lot by lot, where we will never have a historic district. It's a myth. I have heard historic district from the time that I moved into this neighborhood in '74. There have been numerous attempts, and my time is up. It will be continued by Stephen. I object to the fact that next door to me is an empty house, a little cottage, vacant for 4 years as developers are waiting for this. Sorry.
I have two questions. Madam?
Yes.
Have you taken steps to designate the area as a historic district?
Those steps have been taken several times. I think they failed for several reasons. One was the draconian attempt to limit the colors and the scope of fences and the details of that. I think in spirit, there is no one that would deny a historic district. I think it's the implementation of the standards that is the problem. I also think that no one bothers to landmark these important houses. That is a huge thing. We keep talking about it. This is important, we want to save it. Nobody's saying that.
Well, let me stop you there. The reason no one is landmarking is the Landmarks Commission no longer has the authority to do that, so it has to be the owner who comes forward with a landmark.
Well, the owners are not coming forward because they want to, some owners who have these homes want to build to the max.
Can you be specific about what you do not like about this project?
Yes, I can.
What is it?
I don't like, first of all, the process of this development.
No, I'm talking about the appearance of it.
The appearance of it. I hate that top deck. I think it's hideous. Do you think that is historical? That Disneyland creation?
Okay.
And when I asked the architect about it, he was clear to tell me that is the only chance for a glimpse of the ocean on that side, and the deck on the roof is the only chance of a glimpse to the ocean from the other side. My God, the beach is half a block away.
Okay, I get it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Stephen Anaya, followed by Mary Marlowe.
Good evening. I'm going to talk about the R2R process. My name is Stephen Anaya. I live at 130 Fraser Avenue. I've lived on my street for 45 years. I have grandchildren on the street. I have a child on the street. When this project came along, I wasn't aware that behind this 156 there was a 156 and a half that was designated as unimportant, a building that was built in 1910 that would be replaced by a swimming pool, a building on the Sanborn map, 1910. Both houses were built at the same time. I don't understand how you can designate one as historically significant and the rear one, 156, non-significant. Only the criteria is your discretion, which says it's insignificant because you can't see it from the street. And because the demo was approved, it set this whole thing in motion. I miss the R2R. The R2R kept our neighborhood, as long as I was there, pretty safe from over-anxious development. Okay, people had to fight what they wanted, but everything was in reason. The setbacks, 2-story maximum, the parking issues, all were safe under R2R. And there are people in my neighborhood that want the R2R back. We have seen what has happened on Hart. We have seen 120 Hart, which is what everybody wants in Carbon Canyon or Malibu. It can't happen in a small Victorian era neighborhood. There is just a little bit too much. About this project, I appreciate they're saving the front. But I also know this is 3 stories. I object to the cupola on the 3rd story. I object to the rooftop deck, which overlooks the whole neighborhood. I object to the hanging garden effect that 120 ascribes to our neighborhood. And I object to people saying this is a historic neighborhood, but nobody fights for it. Nobody fights for it at planning. Nobody fights for it at landmarks. You don't fight and you pretend. Okay? I'm not against this project as it looks right there at 2 stories, at 2.5 stories. But I kind of object when you take a building out that's on the property that affords space and living area, make a swimming pool of it, and your steps from Pacific Ocean. I hope that R2R comes back, and I hope people will love the neighborhood for its architectural integrity and not lose it in this process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mary Marlowe.
Good evening. I live on Ocean Park. I'm one of the properties behind this property. I'm at 155 Ocean Park. My neighbor's at 157, so we are directly behind. And I have to say, this neighborhood is very special. It's the first beach track in Ocean Park by Abbott Kinney. It's historic. It has no alleys. Everybody's yard is right next to each other. We have the smallest lots in the entire city of Santa Monica. We have the smallest side yard setbacks in the city of Santa Monica. On this street, it's actually 2.5 feet. So if you looked at between the house at 156 Fraser and the one next door, it's 5 feet. It's 2.5 for each of them. That's it. Most districts have at least 5 feet. So this is a really special area. The thing that I'm looking at, I was involved in the planning zoning update. I was on the Ocean Park Committee along with Nina Fresco. And I have to say, we never had rooftop decks, and all decks were variances. So I was shocked, and I can't believe this went over our heads, but we missed that there's now rooftop decks. That when I spoke to the architect this afternoon, and I was shocked when he said, you know, this is in the code. So the thing that we object to, because we see the back of this property where it's more built out, I get why you want to push it back, but to be honest, this is the first sort of visualization I've seen other than the little drawings. I'd rather see that porch come to the front and replace the little one that's there. It's sort of, to my own taste, it's odd to have 2 levels of porch. It's not a historic property anymore. I guess that's the way to put it. And here's my concern, because I do think this should be a historic district, and I will say this motivates me to work on it. That top deck has just got to go, and so does the cupola. That's just out of context for the whole area. And one of the big issues with this, I understand that somebody wants to build and make the house, you know, their dream house. I get that. But it has to fit into the neighborhood, and this just doesn't. And the thing that's really scary is this sets a precedent for the neighborhood for historic houses. If they're allowed to do this, to have a roof deck on the 3rd floor and to have a cupola that goes up there that could easily be an elevator shaft, there goes the neighborhood, because everybody will do it. They're looking for a precedent. You saw some of the pictures where they're single-story homes now. So I'm just looking at it. And our house, we have parking. I will have to say I'm not as upset about the parking as I think some neighbors. But you know what? It cost us more money because it's expensive to have an underground garage. So we paid more because we have parking.
Okay, can you finish your sentence?
Pardon?
Can you finish your sentence?
Yes.
Any questions?
Okay, so thank you.
I actually have a question.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. So because I did walk around the neighborhood today, and I'm just trying to get a sense. The proposed roof deck, would that would come out as actually taller than, say, your roof, right? Am I getting those heights?
It's not taller. I looked at the plans for our house today.
Okay.
And best I can tell, our house is 35 feet tall.
Yeah.
Okay? And we have a peaked roof. Yeah. There. Okay?
Yeah.
We have a peaked roof. And we have a true 2nd story.
Okay.
With the loft. And we do have a deck off the loft, but I think it's lower than this one. And it's integrated into the building.
No public testimony.
No, she's talking about the loft. Okay, no, that's what I'm trying
We
to
didn't get a whole 3rd floor. We got about a third of it in the back for a loft, okay? So.
And your loft is at how many feet? I was just looking around at what was happening on the tops of all the roofs in the neighborhoods, and I was just trying to get a
Our
sense.
loft is, It's integrated. We have a high ceiling in our living room, and the loft is toward the back of the house, but it's all interior to the house.
Okay.
And the deck comes off that loft, but that is built into the house also. It's not on top of a roof.
So it's below 35 feet.
Yes, it's way below 35 feet. It's probably more like 20.
Okay.
You know, something like that, because we have a big peaked roof and that's above it. And it's integrated into the house. It's not set on top of a roof and we have interior stairs. We don't need a parapet. So I just, that's sort of not only a precedent, but something that is disturbing in the neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to interrupt our regularly scheduled program because one of our commissioners has to leave. So
I'm just going to make a
Richard,
couple of
can you make a
observations.
couple of comments?
We've been on the street before. These discussions are never easy between neighbours here, and whatever we do, there'll be a section of this community that's not going to be happy. So that's number one. Number two, I'm a little bit concerned about this. I listened to the architect and I understand the reason for the parking issue. And it's all very logical. The roof deck on the top with an open fire pit and a barbecue just bothers me enormously. And what also bothers me is I'm quite used to houses being very close together in urban settings like terrace housing in Sydney or London, but the back space tends to be the space that you live in, whether it's the bedrooms or whatever. And this is intruding into a lot of that back space of the rest of the neighbours. And so there's an issue in my mind about that, how intrusive that is. And so we rip down this smaller structure at the back and we put a swimming pool in, and then we build up and we project the social life of this house into everyone else's neighbourhood. That does cause me some concern. I'm not an architect, I can't resolve those issues, but it certainly bothers me. And the final thing that bothers me a little bit is the sense in this rather tight-knit neighbourhood, the neighbours feel as if they haven't got to know the applicant as well as they should and understand it. And that's for you guys who are more attuned to this to resolve, but I think they're reasonably significant issues at this hearing tonight. So I apologise for going, but thank you.
Okay. Can we have the applicant? You have 3 minutes, closing arguments.
I'm not sure we have closing arguments per se, but the roof deck in question is about 22 feet above grade. So I just want to clarify that. It's somehow numbers like 30 and 15 feet above height limit and things like that were thrown out. But the roof deck, sorry, let me just check the numbers so I can be accurate.
It's 22 feet and change.
22 feet and
of
change.
average national grading, yes.
I understand the concern about roof decks. You know, obviously the city must have debated it endlessly when they put that code into effect. I'm not sure it's our place here to question that, but I understand neighbors' concern, and I would say that our two immediate neighbors who are the most affected, besides Mary and her husband Mark, who I spoke with earlier, but the two on either side have voiced approval and support for the project. So they would be the most adversely affected besides Mary and Mark. Other than that...
excuse me, Chair, if I could ask that we pause the proceedings until all commissioners are at their seats and paying attention to the testimony, because we have to base our decisions on the record.
Okay, you get extra time.
And I guess just in general, I'd say, you know, obviously it's a tough job trying to figure out how to make a historic home in a historic neighborhood work for today's lifestyle and expectations. But it's particularly hard if we're trying to obviously we're trying to be attuned to neighbors and their desires and wants, but if a roof deck is allowed by code and I don't know that that's what we're debating here. I thought we're asking for variances. So that's my closing argument, I guess.
I have a couple questions. There seems to be a lot of discussion of the fire pit. And what I'm not envisioning is a Girl Scout camp kind of wood fire. I mean, that would be insane.
Yeah, I think it's partly my mistake for mislabeling it.
Can you explain it?
The intent was that we would have heaters up there. It's not glowing embers that are blowing in the breeze.
No, that wouldn't work.
Yeah. So this is more of either gas, or we could go to electric heaters.
Is it sort of like a gravel thing with heat coming up?
Yeah. Originally, we were thinking we'd have some sort of trellis, and it would be overhead heaters like you typically see. In an interest to bring down the height and not alarm people, we decided to eliminate the trellis, and now we're trying to figure out how we could still provide some heat up there.
I guess probably one of the issues of at least one set of neighbors is the intrusion of having people party or be around a fire pit or whatever. Is there any chance of putting the fire pit around the pool?
Yeah, I think we would be open to that.
I think if you eliminated the fire pit, you'd be taking a giant step forward for humankind.
Yeah, it sounds like that. And it sounds like.
I think because there'll be less activity on the roof, And there's a barbecue up there as well?
Yeah, the barbecue. All right.
The pool's not on the roof. No.
We'll move it down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but you could move all that stuff to ground level and just be like a roof deck where people look out. There wouldn't be like activity drawing them. Okay, all right, that really answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, Nina.
Hi. My question is for the owner, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you have owned and restored at least 3 other significant historic buildings. Are they landmarked?
Yes. So the San Francisco one, speaking of Victorian, is actually right next to the Painted Ladies. 940 Grove. You're welcome to look at it or Google it all you want.
So you're familiar with landmark designation procedures and Secretary of Interior standards and Mills Act, and do you know what all
Mills
those
Act
terms
we
are?
have for 940 Grove, so that much I am familiar with, but I'm not
Familiar with the
extremely
Secretary.
well versed. As Chris, I hope, showed, we tried to bring as many people into this as we could to consult from the outside, but happy to talk to more names.
Would you, this is not really in our purview, but let me ask it this way then. Why didn't you consider designating this property as a landmark before proceeding with this process so that we as the community could know that your changes would have appropriate expertise and oversight?
Are you going to throw Kat under the bus? You can't. I just need to know why. Why did we not? What did she want? She's pretty good at this.
Throw Kat under the bus. Let's hear it.
Go for it. Let's go. It's okay.
So early on we did talk about it, but Quinn's wife, Kat, mentioned that there were some, let's say, extra legal hoops they had to jump through up north that they felt like we could handle keeping it, in a historic nature without designating it. So.
Did you actually discuss with our city staff what kinds of hoops we have here, and to see if they are the same, and to see if that's
we did
actually...
talk about it a little bit. We went so far as discussing that if we did designate it, we wouldn't need a variance for parking because it's no longer required.
And this variance would be free? Did you know that?
Yeah, there wouldn't be
no
the $10,000 fee.
Yeah, right.
We talked about all of that, yeah.
And if you're familiar with Mills Act, right? Yeah.
940 Grove in San Francisco.
Right. Okay. Excellent. And what about the State Historic Building Code? Are you familiar with how that might help you? No. Yeah. Okay. Well, And oh yes, you mentioned that you had hired a consultant of some kind, and who was that, and what did they do, and do you have a report? And
We don't have a full report. We spoke with Laura O'Neill at GPA Consulting.
oh, Laura O'Neill, okay, former Landmarks Commissioner. Okay, and let me just double check that I have covered all of my questions here on that. So, are you guys in some kind of a huge pressing hurry? Like, for example, if we were really concerned with giving you an opportunity to consult with neighbors, maybe to do a few massing tweaks for this commission, would that totally set you back and ruin your life?
No, we're in no hurry. I mean, retirement is not imminent by any stretch. So, no, I want to do the right thing. And part of this is just the shock of these neighbors saying, our neighbors, they can't get to know us because we live in San Francisco. And for that, I apologize. It's where my work is. But if it means spending more time and doing the right thing and it sounds like lobbying as much socially as for this, we can. And we always take a recommendation as to who to call and always do it the right way. Don't get me wrong. I think the one thing that I do want to be sensitive to is it does seem to me, my opinion, and I guess in part rebuttal, would be there seem to be more issues with how this all happened than this specific. But I'm happy to answer specific and how this all happened. But just know that you'll have only my word in this. Once we're in already, but once we're in to retire, our job is to keep this as preserved and as historic as we can too. We're on everybody's team in this.
Cool.
But happy to wait and do the right way.
All right, we'll talk more. Thank you.
So I have a few questions, and one of which I'm now informed that I can proceed on. So I'd like to go back to understanding, if I can, and this is on the basis of understanding the floor variances. If I go to page A100, maybe we can start with the architect, with Mr. Stage. So just help me understand, for my information purposes, what didn't work about the existing second dwelling unit on the property that essentially made you want to move it. I mean, that's a substantial expense, so you must have some thinking behind it, that you didn't want to use it. You wanted to essentially take it and put it on the first floor as an extension of the more or less underground first floor.
Yeah, we did. It's a good point, and we did look at that early on as one of the sort of high-level design schemes. Is could we just incorporate that and make sort of a enclave?
Yeah.
You know, honestly, it's hard to say. It just, in the design process, we sort of migrated more towards this approach. I think, you know, there's things like the eave of that back structure is actually over the property line. There's, I wish I should have brought photos of it. It's not as compelling of a structure. I realize it was built in 1910, which makes it very compelling. Sure. But the exterior features are not a sort of characteristic of the period.
And do we happen to know how many sort of paired structures like that from 1910 remain in Santa Monica? I'm just curious. Okay, okay. So now, have you done this? Have you done the soil studies yet for the?
No, we have not.
You haven't.
It's a giant sand dune.
Well, yeah. So, and this guest, what I see on page A100 is a guest bedroom. Am I right in seeing only one window?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. As you're rethinking things, is that something that you would consider trying to get some more light in there?
Yeah, I think it's something we have been thinking about.
And potentially, and I speak from some personal experience with this, some thought about how you're going to manage the moisture that may be inevitable in that room?
Yeah, that's always a challenge with basements, even with sand. You know, sand is the best drainage material for foundations. But
Right.
It still becomes an issue.
Okay. And then as you're thinking about this, one of the things that I would note as a sort of the history of the project is, you're right, you removed the back unit from the rental market and proceeded in that way. Are you aware that state law is actually encouraging us to go towards accessory dwelling units, not to remove them? And so are you aware that with some relatively minor modifications, you could take that back half of the first floor, and even if you weren't operating it currently as an accessory dwelling unit, you could have the infrastructure ready so that in the future it could become a legal attached accessory unit?
ADU. Yeah, honestly, I feel stupid for not realizing that previously, but Lucia actually pointed that out in a meeting, that this looks like a rental unit. And you're right, it could be an ADU down there, but it's not designed with that intent.
Again, for my information purposes only, is that something that you would consider doing so that future, again, this is about the use of the land.
Right. I think you're right, the way it's designed, it makes it compatible with a future use of an ADU and separate. No, I think he's asking, would it be possible for some future owner to convert it if they were so inclined?
Right. If you put in the fixtures, if you figured out that what you have marked as storage could become a kitchen in the future, if there's things like the sink in the laundry room sets you up, makes it harder to do that. But there are you could design this in the way that you do whatever you want with it now, but in the future, someone could return it to independent living, even a multi-generational house for your own family. I mean, there's nothing about accessory dwelling units that require that they be occupied by total strangers.
Sure. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt? I mean, that isn't, this is entirely their prerogative.
I absolutely understand that. I do. And it's entirely this commission's prerogative to think about these particular variances, and that the variance will enable this to happen
if they choose to
do it. That's right. Absolutely.
That's correct.
Okay. So, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Leslie.
I can't remember what I was going to say. No, it was important too. Oh, I just wanted to say, this is sort of a global statement, and it's probably better for discussion.
Okay, save it for discussion.
Then save it. I'll wait then.
Okay. Jason.
I have questions of staff, if now's appropriate time for questions.
We're done with public testimony on the applicant.
Okay. So we heard assertions during public testimony that R2R didn't quite carry over into the 2015 zoning update. Do you have insights into that?
So my understanding is, R2R is a zone district, could go away, but in the R2 zone chapter, there are very specific areas that have their own development standards. For example, along Palisades Beach Road is a very specific section of R2, as is this one. I haven't compared and contrast if everything from R2R got pulled over into this special section of R2, but this area has development standards that differ from the rest of the R2 chapter.
Right. That was the approach, and certainly there is opportunity for confusion because it is a little bit buried. You have to know to look for it, of course, to find it. But you're not aware of anything that related to roof decks and changed what could be done. And certainly there were global changes like the definition of basement that I would imagine would apply to this district unless the code called out different standards.
At the moment, the basement definition is a citywide definition. As far as any upper story outdoor space that may have existed in the R2R, how it was described to me was essentially the R2R was taken and just put into the R2 chapter.
Right.
So I'm not aware if there was any differences, but that's not how it was explained to me.
Right. I have more questions, but I see that Commissioner Fresco is...
I just wanted to comment on that exact thing. As somebody, Mary mentioned, I served on a little committee from the Ocean Park Organization Association neighborhood group for the zoning ordinance. And we actually had a few little tweaks we wanted to make to R2R, and you guys refused to actually make any of them, and it was really a commitment of the Planning Commission and staff not to change them. We wanted to, for example, lower the minimum parcel size so that so many buildings wouldn't have this out of compliance tiny parcel, so that the norm would be defined by the way the code was. But we didn't get that either. So it is exactly as it was before.
Right. Yeah, that was my expectation as well, with the possible exceptions of those citywide.
The
citywide policies being modified. So, excuse me. So is this subject to design review separate from this?
Correct. Even though it's a single family house, which normally typically doesn't go to ARB, this section of R2, single family will go to ARB.
So at ARB, does ARB consider the appropriateness of a historic resource? Or is it the standard ARB process?
Yeah, they will.
They should.
They do.
Will be. Yeah.
I see. So when we are looking at the request, are we looking at the basic massing and then the design questions follow at ARB, or are we being asked tonight to look at both? The massing as it relates to that extra floor, or the definition of the floor?
I mean, the request in front of you is more the massing. However, they are tied together essentially because one affects the other.
Right. And am I right that if we were to seek to reduce it in some way that actually would be code compliant, that the applicant could later come back and apply for the code compliant option, and we would have very little that we could do?
They wouldn't get a third floor.
Yeah, that's what's not code compliant about this case. Everything and the parking, but the enlargement of the base or the first floor or the first story, and even enlargement potentially of the second story, everything is to code. Even the new portions of the building have been pushed in to comply with current setbacks. The existing structure has very small setbacks. It was built at a time where the requirements were very different, but new construction aspects of this will comply to current code for height, for setbacks. The issue is the third story.
But just the point is that if we said, yeah, we'll approve the third story, if you dial back in a certain area that actually is code compliant, they could just come back and apply later for something that's code compliant, and there'd be nothing that we could do about it.
Well, the third story will never be code compliant without your approval tonight, because
what I'm saying is,
I'm sorry, maybe I'm not understanding.
If we were to tonight approve the third story, but in a modified way where they were reducing something that actually was code compliant, my understanding is that they could later come back and say, we want the full code compliant option here with this third story that we have. And there's nothing that we really could do to.
I think with the approval of the third story, you're also kind of approving a set square footage to it. So I don't believe it could get bigger without a modification to the variance.
Right. But once they came to us asking for something that was completely code compliant, we would not have any basis for saying
actually, let me introduce something here. We had the exact problem that Jason is referring to, where there was a previous approval to define something, and it had introduced some, let's call, constraints
Okay.
that were smaller than the code compliant, and then the owner came back later and said, well, I want my code compliant things back, so they ended up with 2 bites of the apple in effect. So
On this very street.
on this very street. So
Can I
it's-
ask staff some questions? I haven't had a chance to do that.
Yeah,
No,
but
I
let me
still have the
finish.
floor.
Let me
I
finish.
have
and
my
then-
line of questioning. So going into the findings, I noticed, and maybe I just overlooked it, on your list of findings, I did not see the finding that the project would not be detrimental nor injurious to the area. You were just...
I was just,
Yeah,
there's
okay.
10 of them. I was trying to kind of sum it
The big
in.
ones.
But yes, that is still very much a finding.
Okay. And it seems when I look at staff's proposed findings, you seem to compare, well, on the question of whether the parking variance would be detrimental, you seem to compare it to the existing conditions. Whereas I am accustomed to looking at it as comparing it to a code compliant project where the parking would be on site. Could you speak to the appropriateness of looking at it one way or the other, whether it's a matter of philosophy, whether there is a clear right way and wrong way to evaluate that question?
I think how the findings are written, or how staff determined the findings could be made, was essentially to make this a code compliant house, you would have to most likely demolish the front porch to provide that parking. So those were tied together because to keep this potential historic resource, some design options weren't possible to then make it code compliant. If it wasn't on the HRI, they could demolish the whole building and make a code compliant house. But their attempt was to retain as much of the house as possible, to not remove it from the HRI list or to take it off of a contributor to a potential district. And because of that, it provided hardships to then provide some of the code that would be required. Mm-hmm. So they were tied together, essentially. Did that
right.
answer?
I understand the reason for the application, and I also see that there are public benefits to be realized with the retention of this this historic resource. The thing that I'm going to be grappling with in our discussion is whether the approval of this project, of this request, where we are saying the code says that when you modify a structure like is being proposed, at that point you need to put in code compliant parking.
They're interrelated, yes.
And so then we're saying, all right, they're going and doing this thing that triggers this code requirement. How is it not detrimental to the neighborhood that this parking impacted neighborhood, that we are not requiring that they provide off-street parking per code? So that's the question that I have, and if you have any insights to share that will help me as I grapple with that question, I appreciate it.
I guess the only thing to not so much answer but to add was that the 50% would have only would have allowed them to add on 582 square feet without triggering the parking requirement. Any amount over that does trigger the parking requirement, and as mentioned earlier, parking would be extremely difficult to add to this parcel, and no existing parking currently is on site. And I think the request is just allowing for that continuation because of these interrelated variances. One essentially triggered the other.
Thank you.
Yeah. Got a chance to ask questions.
I just have to make one more comment about that. Our code also says that if a property is a designated landmark, that the parking can be waived. So it is actually a priority that our code has already defined for us. It's not designated, but
Can I?
yeah, I did. I know. I'm just saying that the standard, the balance is in the code already.
Can I just, I need to say something at this point, because Ross has been the staff to the R1 task force for months. And one of the major points coming out of the R1 task force is how do we incentivize the retention of existing single-family homes? And one of the points raised by this multitude of people is do not trigger new parking requirements, because that discourages the retention of single-family homes. It's a very bad idea. So that, in addition to the historic nature of the front of this house, totally argues for me that providing parking is nuts.
Can I ask just a clarifying question on the parking requirement of staff? Just one quick clarifying question on the parking requirement. If the basement, if the first floor had been proposed as an attached ADU in this zone, would the parking requirement have been waived?
So one thing though, an ADU is actually not allowed on this parcel. So ADUs can only be allowed for a parcel that is larger than 4,000 square feet.
That's true.
So at the current code, an ADU wouldn't be permitted on this parcel.
Under state law?
Our law. It's our law.
I know that's
Our
our
law,
law. I'm
but-
not sure.
Well,
That's
maybe
law, but
state
that is
But
ours at the moment.
I think my understanding was under state law they could then convert it, but
But
let's,
it's R2R.
But
it's
the state
R2R.
law is 4,000 square feet.
okay, but it's R2R, so it's okay?
Because R2R means R2 is multifamily, two units.
The state says it can't be on anything.
So she is correct, though. So because this is R2, it could be multifamily. So I
Right.
guess what you want to say is it's not to add an ADU, but they do have a potential to just make that a unit, essentially. In this zone district or this specific area of R2, you will take the lot size, divide that by 1,500, and whatever that number comes to is how many units you can have.
But then you
I
get
did the
screwed with
math,
parking.
comes to 1.7, which
Yes.
rounds to 2. So
At
that's
which
how it
point
could
the parking
possibly-
requirement
you don't wanna-
remains
don't
in
wanna do
place.
that, right?
Which then, since you're adding a new unit, you would have to then provide parking for that extra unit, which
Okay.
I don't know if you could do the unit because you essentially couldn't
What a
add parking.
catch
I
22.
tried.
Yeah, it's a exactly.
I have a couple really simple questions.
Make
Are
them quick.
roof decks allowed by right under code?
Yes, there is
So-
nothing in this section of the R2, at least at the moment, that prohibits any upper story outdoor space. If
So-
it did in the past, I'm not sure, but I can only speak to today's
Okay, so
code.
we have no discretion over whether or not there's a roof deck.
No.
They're not here for that. Are the stairways to get up to the roof deck, you said they were allowed to go 14 feet above the roof, but this one doesn't.
It only goes 5 feet above the roof line. It could go 14 feet.
But that is also by right.
Correct.
Okay. And they seem to be agreeable to moving the fire pit and the barbecue and everything to the ground nearby the swimming pool, so.
Sounds like it.
And I also wanted to point out, isn't it true that actually in the staff report, we taught, and Nina will certainly talk about this, that we will require that improvements made to this house be consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Very much so.
And
we will pass that along
there
to
needs
them.
to be a consultant from somewhere, somehow, who actually signs off on that, and that direction needs to go to the ARB, seriously go to the ARB.
That would be a suggestion you can make, yes.
Nina.
I'm done with questions. If you guys are, I'd like to just jump right in, if that's okay.
I have one follow-up.
Okay, one more question.
If tonight the request for the third story was approved and the parking was not, does the applicant have the option of addressing the parking through landmarking?
I mean, yes, if they landmark the building, then they could, I guess, not have to comply with parking standards. However, you really can't approve the third story without also currently approving the variance for the parking, because the third story is 733 square feet, which is already over the 50% threshold. So they go hand in hand, essentially. There are potential other ways, which is a very different process than obviously what we're here today, that is available if they would so choose to.
But we could do the parking without the third story.
Yes. I don't know. Because I think even adding on to the basement, the first story, also would just trigger the parking essentially. So it's all of it essentially.
But you can't go that direction, but you can go the other. You could do parking, but not third story.
Yes.
Okay.
But you
Just
would,
for clarity.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Nina, please.
I might.
Okay, this is a really, really important house. It is a very rare building because it is one of 7 individually eligible buildings in a historic district with, or a potential historic district with 103 contributors. So it's and to me, that is the key for why we want to approve, why we would look at this variance. That's the thing that makes it unique, that makes us want to look at it. I think, in the past, we've had a lot of variances. The reason we came to the Planning Commission and asked to reduce the parcel size, the minimum parcel size for this area, is we took a walk in the neighborhood and noticed that a lot of houses that looked like they were busting out of their seams were all houses that had variances, and I actually looked it up on the ancient website back when the search mechanism worked. And I learned that almost every time the finding was based on the fact that it was a substandard lot size, even though that is not a unique thing for any parcel in this district. So we really, when we look at these variances for this kind of thing, we have to really make sure there is something unique about the building that makes us want to consider it. And in this case, the thing that's unique is that there is a historic structure there that has, and it is a historic resource. Our code defines a historic resource as something included on the HRI. So it's not a potential historic resource, it is a historic resource. But it has the potential for a full individual high-level designation under our city code. And so we don't want them to tear it down and build a code-compliant house that could have a basement and then 2 above-ground stories, because we would lose a historic resource, and that is an important priority for us to keep it. So that's why we have to also, when we approve this, focus on preserving the historic resource. Because if the historic resource is undermined by this addition, then we no longer make the findings for the variance. So the conditions have to ensure that the historic resource remains eligible in the way that it is eligible today. Obviously, it would be ideal if it had been landmarked before we got here, so we didn't have to do this loopy thing that we're going to try to pull off. But we can talk about that later. So that's kind of the direction that I am looking at for this building. So one of the really important things about defining the significance of a historic resource is not only character-defining features. Character-defining features are the jewelry. They're the objects on the front that you can see. But the way a historic resource is evaluated for designation has to do with its integrity. And I shared with the commission, and it went into the public record, some information that I downloaded from the National Park Service website about the National Register criteria for integrity, which has 7 aspects, and they have to do with design intention and workmanship and materials and things like that, that hopefully will help you and the public and the applicant understand what it means to preserve the integrity of a building and not just the character-defining features. And then the other way to evaluate whether a building remains a historic resource after change or during change is to evaluate it according to the Secretary of Interior standards. And given the 7 aspects of integrity and how those are expressed in the structure and what the character-defining features are, we then look at these standards and see what change can be done to maintain the character-defining features and the integrity. So in this case, one of the key ones to look at would be compatibility, because we're going to see a thing on top of the roof, whether it's big or small, there it is, that's the thing. And we have to make sure that it's compatible, that it looks like the thing is a design piece, that it doesn't jar us and make us feel like something was slapped on there. But it also has to be subordinate in some way. Compatibility, there's this balance between compatible and differentiated that we struggle with, in this field. It's a subjective area, really. Can you tell which part of the building is original just by looking at it? Can you tell which part of the building was added on? But is it also harmonious? Harmonious is one of the words in the Secretary of the Interior standards. So you don't want to throw off the vibe of the building. But so it's basically, there's a lot to consider that goes way past, okay, the clinker brick is going to stay, the shed roof dormer is going to stay, and we're going to stick this thing back there. But to me, what I see just looking at that is that roof, that porch with the roof on it, really kind of fights with the shed roof dormer. I find it disconcerting, personally. I would rather see that volume pushed back even further so we really get a sense of the whole volume, at least of the street-facing section of the existing house. That's how I see it. When I looked at my Google Maps, I realized that this building, it has like a side-facing gable volume, and then in the back, there's something that goes straight back that has a rear-facing gable, and it meets the roof in a funny way. So if that addition were back a little further so that we could read that, or that it could be read by somebody who wanted to study this type of house, because that's one of our criteria. Is it a good example of a period of architecture? What valuable to a study of that style or period or method of construction? So we want to make sure that, because it really is as it stands there, in my opinion, I'm not a landmarks commissioner, but I believe it would meet that standard. We want to make sure that it would still meet that standard when we add this addition. So that's why I would rather this were already designated and that the experts we have in City Hall were the ones who were looking at it. I love ARB, but they are not experts in this area. So if we don't designate it before we proceed with this process, I would like to have a condition put on that would ask the owner to pay for the city's impartial, consultant to do a study on this, to analyze it both in terms of the Secretary of Interior's standards and also the 7 aspects of integrity, and then provide that report to the ARB, and maybe even have the consultant there so the ARB, who is not well versed in this topic, can ask questions and really give them an opportunity to do the very best possible job at evaluating this for you and with you. And maybe you can get other advice, but there are lots of ways you can do that. But so that's kind of the direction that I see for this moving forward. As far as the parking and the other issues, for me, obviously, parking would not be an issue for a historic resource if it were designated, and I believe that we have to treat this and condition it in every way we can to make it be treated as designated, and maybe it will be soon. And also because of what Leslie was saying about R1, I just think that those parking standards in this day and age are destroying the existing fabric of R1 neighborhoods in our city. Another thing to know about the comparables that we saw and parking in this neighborhood, I looked at some maps this afternoon and noted that 8 buildings on this block were built originally with parking, and some of them had 7-foot wide driveways, which I guess was adequate for a Model A, but some of them the cars just sort of nose in towards them now. And now there are about 19 properties or so. I'm not sure exactly. I didn't count myself, but we got that in a letter. And I noted that of all of the properties that have been added onto, only 2 of them that have had parking added to them, only 2 of them have had parking added in a way that did not destroy the historic character of the structure by lifting it off the ground and sticking a garage in and making it into a whole rebuilt thing that lost its context. You know, siting and context and setting are parts of integrity. So even though it still looks like the building and it's still there, it's lost integrity when that happens, and that is a really important thing about his character of a historic resource. So, so I would totally be in favor of the parking variance for this. I think that's really the only way to approach it. Another thing that has to do with comparable size, especially in a historic district, our goal is not to equalize and turn all of the buildings into something that is similar to all the other buildings. The buildings should be expressive of how they were when they were built. So, and also a lot of those larger houses that were added on before the R2R standards came into existence, and we have decided that those old standards were not a good idea. So it is not incumbent upon us to make sure that every new project meets those former standards that we have moved on from. So that's another reason to be really careful about how we look at it. So with that in mind, that brings me to the findings, and there's some cleaning up that I would like to suggest for the findings to make sure that the findings are clear that the reason this qualifies for this variance is because it's a historic property where it prevents, preservation of the resource prevents this owner from adding a floor that would otherwise be allowed for code if they could start from scratch. So that is a really clear reason for a variance. But there are a couple of places in here which I'll point out later on. I'm just getting it all out now.
We're going to Photoshop that out.
I'm almost done. So we want to make sure that the findings don't say that we're allowing this because other people have done it, because that's really not the kind of finding that we want to make here today. And then I have a couple of conditions and direction that I would like to send to ARB based just on my own personal expertise in historic preservation, which, in case you hadn't noticed, that's
can we
kind of
hold
my
that
area.
until the end?
I will, yes.
Okay. Roxanne, please.
Thank you. So you'll bear with me, I have some not fully formed comments yet, but I do want to speak to dial the discussion about the historic status of the property. I want to take us back a few steps, and then also just provide a few framing comments with respect to staff's analysis and ultimately what is before you in the form of a CEQA exemption. So let me just start with, it's a bit of a technicality, and Commissioner Fresco knows I staff Landmarks Commission for almost 5 years and have worked closely with the program and agree with Commissioner Fresco's assessment that this is, the dual status on the HRI as potentially individually eligible and also a potential contributor to a potential historic district. That's, something that staff, takes note of as well when we review a property that's listed on the HRI. From a technical and just a clarity standpoint, based on the code's definition of what is an historic resource, capital H, capital R, this property doesn't meet that standard. To Commissioner Fresco's point, in terms of the way we review a property with respect to compliance with the standards, the way we take a conservative approach, we're treating this as a potential resource, agreed that is, as provided in your draft findings, that's an explanation for what is a specific characteristic that doesn't necessarily apply to every property, in the neighborhood. We took a careful look at that. In applying the standards, staff put its recommendation forward. If there's some additional modifications that this commission is suggesting, in that the project doesn't fully comply, we'd like to know what that is. We'd like to deal with that now. That we don't believe that a condition is appropriate in terms of saying the project will comply with the standards in the future, provided that there's a consultant's report. I think there's an issue, we need to deal with it in order to make the CEQA exemption that we have provided to go along with the proposal. That being said, the overall attention to the details of this house, in addition to understanding how setting may have been impacted. Commissioner Fresco brought up the 7 aspects of integrity. Just want to make a note that the burden of the loss of setting, that's not on this property. If we were to even be applying the 7 aspects of integrity, that's an analytical tool, not a threshold necessarily for application of the standards. But all of this analysis, this framework for analysis, we do bring forward in a more conservative and protective fashion. But our recommendation is the project's exempt as it does comply with the standards. That's staff's recommendation. If this commission doesn't feel we quite met that mark, please tell us how. We want to go back and take a look at that. But we would want that affirmative finding of compliance vis-a-vis the class 31 exemption that needs to be dealt with here at this hearing, not something that we would want to defer. Although guidance for additional areas of focus for the ARB, I think that's totally appropriate, but not we don't think a finding of compliance with the standard can be contingent on a future study.
Okay, thank you.
Can you just explain, it was always my understanding that if a property is listed on the HRI, because we never submitted our HRI to the state and adopted it in the ways that we've always wished that we had, that CEQA didn't apply. So I'm very confused by CEQA suddenly coming into play here, so I need an explanation, please.
So you are correct that just simply by virtue of the property being listed on the HRI, because it is not in the DCP area, that this is not a presumptive resource, which a landmark, a structure of merit, that's a presumptive resource. However, in this case, particularly based on the record that was created this evening, it would be very difficult for the city to treat it as something other than a historic resource for purposes of CEQA. So there are different standards. So there are several categories. There's mandatory, presumptive, and then this third category, which allows the public agency to determine that the property is nonetheless a historic resource. So given the way this property has been treated this evening for purposes of CEQA, it would be difficult to argue that it did not deserve or warrant that protection. And in fact, that's in the staff report as listed, the class 31 exemption, which is why Ms. Tanamori was explaining that in order for you to proceed, that the consistency with the findings standard is necessary in order to assure that all the CEQA clearances have been taken care of. And one tiny thing I did want to also just kind of clarify. So I understand that, again, this property may be unique in terms of its position on the HRI. And certainly if somebody were to file an application and the Landmarks Commission were to consider it, it is possible that they would landmark it, but they do exercise discretion, and it is not just something that they would just automatically, they would have to go through a full hearing, a full process. There would be a very thorough consultant's report to be done as part of that process. So just by virtue of it being on the HRI does not mean that the Landmarks Commission would necessarily automatically designate it.
I know what she's saying. Basically, because I just made this case, especially because I just made this case that this qualifies for a variance because it is a presumptive historic resource, that we need to make sure that it meets the Secretary of Interior standards according to CEQA.
That was in the staff report.
Huh?
That was in the staff report.
It was? How did I miss that?
It said second, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Secretary of Interior's, yeah, but not, I missed the CEQA part if it was in there. But the thing that is tricky about this is that whenever anybody does anything to a building before it was landmarked, not whenever, but often when people do change things on buildings before they are landmarked, and even if it's really scrupulously according to the standards, and then an application is filed, the consultant will almost always say, well, something's been done to this building, it no longer has integrity, and I don't think it qualifies. Which are, and often these are changes that would totally pass muster after, this is just my own personal issue, but that is why I really wanted this integrity study, is to make sure that any way that we look at it, to use that analytical tool to make sure that we really are protecting the value.
But just to clarify, the property is not designated yet. This hearing is an associate.
Right.
I think you and I, we agree on many things with respect to this property, the tools that are helpful to use and employ when reviewing a property, in this case that's listed on the HRI as a potential. But I think we want to focus it back in that this property isn't up for a designation hearing, and we're not applying a higher threshold and standard for review. We just aren't, although helpful as a background in framing the key issues.
So let me try to focus something, because I'm listening to Commissioner Perry and listening to Commissioner Fresco. I'm seeing a level of uncertainty in the findings as currently drafted that raise concerns for me, and this is new for me, so I want to start by saying this is new for me, but I also recognize that this is complex and important, and I also think that our applicant this is our applicant's first opportunity to have heard the discussion on the dais from the Planning Commission with respect to the kinds of concerns that are being raised, and with respect to the options that may have been afforded, the applicant may or may not have chosen to use. And so I'm having, in order for me to get to a yes, legally I have to be able to make the findings. And I'm still confused because of the uncertainties that Commissioner Fresco has raised and because of the concerns that Commissioner Perry has raised. And so the question that I would pose is whether or not this might not benefit from, and there were some questions that were raised about some potential redesigns that are, again, fully within the applicant's discretion to choose to make. I'm going to make that really clear, particularly with respect to whatever the association with gas and fire and heat is happening on the roof, the use of the roof, and with whatever is happening in the first floor of that back half. The question that I would pose is whether or not what the desire is here. I mean, if we push through, I don't know where we land. Would the applicant like the opportunity to go away and think, since he stated he's not in a rush, and would there be an opportunity for staff and in particular Commissioner Fresco to get these findings into shape that would allow us to proceed with much more certainty? I say this as a newbie at this, but I need to be able to feel comfortable with these findings, and I'm open to getting there. I'm not there yet.
I want to know that I understand this. Based on Nina's oratory, there's all this historic significance being considered in what's done to the building and Department of Interior, da-da-da-da-da. If we get too far, and it sounds like maybe we have, or we're on the brink, that triggers CEQA. Am I correct? And what does that mean, triggering CEQA?
So if I heard you correctly, you were wondering about whether or not, based on the scope of this discussion, CEQA's been triggered. CEQA was already triggered. There was a staff determination based on the way state law outlines what's a mandatory resource, presumptive resource,
Right.
et cetera. So we're in the category where there was a determination made based on information that we would treat it as a potential. And that's also too just from a policy standpoint, in looking at the proposal, just to be protective, as part of our planning review.
Well, what happened
but
different
the trigger
tonight?
The trigger wasn't based on the scope of the discussion.
I had the feeling that somehow we had passed a threshold beyond which we weren't before we started talking.
Well, so the record that's created this evening
Right.
includes what's in the staff report.
Right.
So I just meant the whole record of the proceedings. So it's the staff report, it's the testimony that we've received, and it's all of it.
Well, what would stop us from using the conditions that Nina's come up with for approval of the project? Or is that something that needs to be deliberated later or discussed?
It would need to be made very clear that the commission felt that it still met the Secretary of Interior standards
Right.
for purposes of qualifying for the Class 31 exemption. So I think that's where Ms. Tanamori was trying to get clarification, and that's where her concern is if the condition is drafted in such a way that it says we feel that it does, but maybe further refinements could happen, perhaps that's something that could work. But if the condition is drafted that it needs to somehow at a future point comply with the standards, but it doesn't now, that's where the CEQA
Right.
issue comes in.
Which is why I asked whether this was an opportunity to
Well,
continue the project.
what's the process after, if we follow what you're saying, what's the process after tonight?
Well, it sounds like some suggestions have been made about, in particular, Commissioner Fresco raised some concerns about the way the
No, I understand.
parapet and the roof
Right,
work,
right.
right? And we've heard from the applicant that the applicant is open to rethinking that use on the roof.
So what you're saying is continue it and allow the applicant to meet with Nina or whomever else to go over what we've been talking about tonight.
Right, and with staff and to make sure, because I also heard Commissioner Fresco raising some concerns about specific language in the finding. For example, we're doing this because we want it to look like everything else, and we don't want to say that,
Okay,
so that we're actually
it's a
cleaning
rewriting
up
of the conditions of
Yes,
what you're talking about.
Exactly.
But just for the record, I support the parking variance.
So do I.
So we can make some progress.
Yeah,
Okay.
I do too. But I understand it's a package, and
I know.
Right.
I know.
Okay.
Okay, well, let me step into this here and see if we can get some clarity. It seems to me our first responsibility is we all took the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. And so we do not want to do harm to this building because at some future date, it might or might not become a landmark. But our job is to keep that viability open. So that's the first thing. That goes and supports everything we're going to do. As far as the parking goes, I think there is, it's actually a kind of a complicated discussion. Right now, in front of this house, there is one public parking space that's used by the entire street. The parking load of this building presumably has gone down because one unit was removed. So now you have basically, instead of, let's say, 4 cars fighting for those parking spaces, you now have 2 cars fighting for those parking spaces. Were we to add a garage, you would have 2 private spaces in the garage, but you would lose.
You didn't have no house.
Right. But let me finish the discussion. You would lose the front common parking space for everybody. So the community would lose 1 space. The private would gain 1 space. They would actually create a 3rd space because they'd be able to park in front of their own driveway, which the rest of the public can't do. So I don't know if I'm addressing your concern, Jason, about parking. In real life, to insist on the parking standard would mean, in real life, that the public would lose 1 space and there would get a drop of 1 parking load less, if you will. Now it happens that this house is 100 feet from a huge parking lot, which all of those streets have access to with permitted parking, just parking across Nielsen. So they're in a special situation. In other words, that extra car or 2 that might be loaded up by this car can find a home nearby without much suffering. So I would take the parking issue off the table. So that's, in my mind, gone. So, and let's just take a straw vote. Anyone comfortable with that?
Little grappling.
Still grappling. Okay, grapple away. So moving on. Let's move up to, no, that's our strawberries. Okay, a thumbs up. Okay. So let's move on to the, let's call it the gazebo at the top. The gazebo at the top is completely unnecessary. You could cut that off and exit the doorway at the stair mid-level and then come up the steps and get onto the roof deck as they have it today. So that gazebo up there, whatever you want to call it, lantern, what, even if it's by right, I'm just saying our job is to do no harm. We're not trying to pump up the neighborhood. We're trying to keep everything very modest. And actually what we're really trying to do is reduce the scale and massing of the addition in relation to the front house, so the front house has a higher probability of maintaining its integrity. Because if I just added a trellis off the back, everyone would say it's still have integrity. If I added a 3-story object in the back, everyone would say it's gone. So where's that middle point? Well, the more you can peel away the unnecessary things, the more integrity might be left in this building, which is what we're trying to protect. So then the last step in this is I would take the roof deck, which has been an object of controversy, particularly in such narrow and closely aligned buildings. It's basically, there's just virtually no setbacks, and say that we set back the roof deck as you're supposed to do in Ocean Park, which has even larger lots. You're supposed to set your roof back 3 feet from the edges of the roof. So I think that would be a legitimate way of addressing the concerns of the neighbors.
Do we have the authority to do that?
Remember, we're granting variances, so we can make trade-offs.
Heidi, what do you think?
I think you either make the findings for the variance or not. You do have some authority to condition a variance under the code in order to ensure compliance with the findings. So just like with all of your other issues, everything has to go back to the findings. So if it somehow fits into whether or not it meets the findings, then perhaps you can do it. It doesn't sound that easy to do in this particular instance, but it's potentially possible.
All right.
Okay, so what I'm saying is there's a path forward here that is available to us that allows this project to move forward. Let's now talk about the third floor. What really happened on this project is they took an object that was historical in the back and they demolished it, and then they shoved the pieces under the house. That's really what they did. Now, if you were a neighbor and you said, which would you rather have, an open backyard or a house gone, and trying to recreate what was kind of the desirable outcome, which was an open rear yard going all the way down to the ocean, this helps reestablish that. Although it was lost in 1908 when this back house was built, it's now back, because that back house is gone.
Landmark said it was not historic.
I know that they may have made a mistake, but on paper, that thing is gone. So the point is, would you rather have the mass of that object in the backyard or the mass of the object under the house? Last point I'd like to make, this house has a 3-story object simply because the floor level is 6 inches from where it should be. Now, the height of the building is exactly the same. I could take that floor and move it up and down. As far as the neighbor's concerned, who cares? It has no impact. So I would say that the variance regarding the floor is within the spirit of doing no harm to the original building, the fabric of the original building. So if we have consensus on that, I think we have a way to move forward. I know you're still grappling. So now we're going to get to the thorniest issue, which is, have we scaled down the addition to the back of the building so that the main front house, which is, to be honest, a very modest structure, have we scaled it down enough to where we can say, yes, we have brought them into alignment? And I would like to propose a solution for your consideration. That if you take, and this is a perfect picture to look at, if you take the existing roof line of the house, the main roof, not the eyebrow dormer, you take the existing roof line of the house and you extend it forward. You extend it all the way up till it hits the height limit, which is 30 feet or 28 feet, whatever the building is.
Wait, start that again?
Okay.
You want to extend the original roof?
Well, hear me out.
Oh, that's just a line you're drawing for?
I'm drawing a line in the air, okay? I'm drawing. No, remember that roof is here, and I'm saying extend the line forward. Extend the line forward and make the addition sit under that line. So you do whatever you want under that line, but do not exceed that line. What's that? The rationale is it would peel off the front balcony roof. That would be gone. And it would lower a little bit the front top plate of the building, the front wall of the building. So it would be scaling down the building, probably that front edge of it by about a foot. You don't really need a balcony overhang in that area because that's a northwest, northeast facing balcony. You don't need the roof for that. So you would just have a standard eave, a standard overhang like any other building. And that line would essentially lower the mass of that addition. You wouldn't see it as much. You would see it maybe half to a third as much.
You take the balcony off, basically.
Yeah. No, the balcony is still there, but the roof off the balcony is gone. It's a deck. It's a roof deck.
But, okay.
In fact, let me say one
Yeah.
good thing about that roof deck is that roof deck doesn't go all the way out to the edges of the building. It's actually pulled in, which is a nice detail. It's another articulation to it.
Can you, I just want to understand where you're going with this, because when I walked around this afternoon, one of the things that I noticed about the various homes in the neighborhood is that although the heights were different and although these were expressed differently, there wasn't generally that kind of roofline continuity that you're describing. There were, I would call them boxes sitting on top of roofs. And so as much as I like your suggestion, I have a concern. That's, again, it's why I'm going for some form of a continuance, because I think the applicant ought to have the opportunity to take all of these ideas into consideration, come back with something that is workable with respect to their vision and with respect to the concerns that we've raised. I don't feel as uncomfortable as I feel equally uncomfortable imposing that kind of a design solution from the dais on this first hearing. I just have to frame that.
Okay.
I like your idea.
Well,
but what
me
matters is
too.
he has to like it.
Well, the point I'm making is we're studying ways of demassing the object.
Okay.
And let's say there's 100 ways to demask the object. This is a really simple way that protects the integrity of the design.
You know what? This isn't. Our goal here is not necessarily to demask the object. The idea is to make it harmonious and compatible. And your approach is an engineer's approach, which is one way to look at it, and I appreciate that. But I think that I mean, one of the reasons I asked the applicant if he was in a hurry is because I really think that we should be giving direction on what we see as harmonious and compatible and an appropriate approach to this applicant, and give them an opportunity to comply with that before we make a decision, and hopefully bring us renderings. We like renderings too. Elevations are a little hard to get everything we need out of. So that's what I would suggest. Because I was not aware of staff's of this CEQA issue before, I didn't actually spend a lot of time deciding for tonight exactly how I think this could be compliant with the Secretary of Interior standards myself. I haven't, so I wouldn't even be prepared to say tonight, this is what you have to do, and then we can sign off. So I'm not sure. I mean, I can tell you the conditions or the design choices that I wanted to look at, you know, for the future that I thought needed attention, and maybe from there you guys can put in your 2 cents about heat elements on the ground and so forth, and you guys can come back and show us those. Right, but we're trying to give direction for the continuance so it's productive. Oh, Jason is.
No, I want to hear what you have to say, Commissioner Fresco.
So I'm sorry, my pages are all out of order now. I have 4 pages of notes on this. It's very excessive. I was concerned about the addition intruding on the ability of the original volumes of the house to be read as the original volumes, and that the new portion really be visually a set-in thing that can be visually differentiated. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can I respond?
Why don't you come up to the dais so we can, is that okay?
We're reopening the public hearing.
Are we breaking rules?
No, we're reopening the public hearing.
We just broke them for you.
Okay. Sorry, not familiar. Well, the addition does follow the new setbacks, so the walls are actually offset from the original mass of the house because.
Right, but also even from, hold on. Even from this view, the page A300, when we look at it this way to make sure that we can, it almost looks like interlocking. I mean, it sort of does that already, but making sure that we can really see that this was a house with 2 kinds of roofs, and then a new thing was
added on.
You see what I'm saying?
One thing we've talked about is maybe the same type of siding, but a different spacing that helps visually differentiate the original from the new.
There's
things
funny
like that.
ways to do that, different scale. I mean, I live in a really old house, and the back half actually had a vertical 12-inch wide tongue and groove board on the back portion, and then the thin lap siding on the front portion. It was just, there are all kinds of ways you can differentiate that would really capture and respond to the sort of beach house / shed feeling of this neighborhood.
It's always hard because you want it to feel integral, but differentiated. And as you said, it has to sort of defer to what was originally there. So
it's a really subtle kind of back and you don't want it to look funky and like stuck on either. Yeah. So it's a thing. I'm sure that lots of people will yell at me for saying this, but I'm gonna say it, that because I think that it might need to come back just a little further to, I personally would not be opposed to considering a different kind of variance that would allow part of it to come into the, closer to the side, on the west side, so that at least you could regain some square footage that you would lost. Of course, I'm only one person and I would have to see it, but to me that doesn't sound from here like a terrible, terrible idea. We'd have to see what the others think. As you can see, there's only 5 of us here now, but there's 7 when you get a full complement. If the street-facing balcony or deck or whatever it is still desired, I really think that fights with the little dormer. That little dormer is the cutest little dormer I've ever seen, and it should rule.
Yeah.
When you look at the elevations, the way the top thing is actually scaled, I mean, you never see it the way you see it in the elevations, but it really looks like a giant, big version of a little dormer, and that kind of was scary.
I mean, the elevations are always tricky because.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Would you be satisfied if they took the roof off the balcony?
I think that might be a great way of taking
And just
away
put like a 42-inch wall or whatever instead?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't
think
want to
we'd
tell
be
him what
open
to
to
do.
that.
I just want to tell him. I'm trying not to tell you what to do.
No, yeah, I think it's certainly something that we'd be open to considering.
I mean, you can figure it out. I mean, we're making it into a deck, whatever, Another idea I thought, because the stair tower sticking up above everything else just is kind of, to me, it's a little much. For that little tiny, because the thing about that house is it's like a little tiny cottage.
You're right.
So you don't want it to really change that feeling. And if, for example, you chose to set your rear roof deck in on the side, you could put an exterior staircase up to it. And so you could leave the house and then go up the stairs on the outside to get on the deck.
Mm-hmm.
And then nothing would have to stick up. So that's an idea. I don't know. And those were really that was pretty much it. So I know that's complicated, and there are professionals, there's people at the Conservancy, the Santa Monica Conservancy. I'm happy to meet with you to the extent, of course, I'd have to take notes and tell everybody what we said, but I would be happy to meet with you also.
Sure, great, thanks.
Okay, do we have any other discussion?
I move that we continue this to the next available opportunity when the applicant is ready.
Okay, any discussion on the motion?
Do we want to act on the parking tonight, or just wait for everything at one time?
Let's just wait.
Okay.
Is there any discussion regarding the continuance?
You're okay?
Okay.
I would simply encourage some additional outreach. Take advantage of the time as best you can. You've already offered to do that, so I think it's a good opportunity. And it sounds like there's a pathway here that the feedback has generated to a successful resolution that provides everyone with some certainty. So, yeah.
Okay. Before we vote, I'd like to say a few things and sort of put this in what I call the best frame that we have, which is, first of all, we did get tremendous neighborhood output, letters, conversations, and all these people really do love their neighborhood. And they're all looking at this elephant and describing it in different ways. And I think it's valuable to have that discussion. So, and I think that most people would agree that preserving this object, whether it's landmarkable or landmarked or historical resources, the guiding light that drives everything. And that if we agree on that, a lot of things become easy decisions downstreams. They become minor decisions. If you feel that parking should dominate a potential landmark, then we're going the wrong way for you. And I'm sorry if that's the case, but parking is a big thing and will continue to be a big thing. But in this particular case, I think it has to take second seat to the landmarking issues. And the last thing I'd like to bring up is the first thing that Nina brought up, which is the idea of precedent. Are we setting a bad precedent? And I would like to contain the precedent to those 7 blessed landmarkable buildings in this neighborhood. We are setting a precedent for those 7 buildings, if we are setting a precedent, because that's how they will be viewed, because they will have the same benefit, landmarked or landmarkable, that this lot have. So we're not setting a global precedent for the whole neighborhood. We're not saying, everybody forget you need parking. We're not saying that. We're saying in this particular case, a clinker block brick facade, which is a very rare object in our city, is worth preserving in lieu of parking. That's what we're really saying at the bottom line. So as far as the next round, I hope that you have gotten enough feedback, and I bet you're surprised. I thought there would be this huge debate on parking. I thought there was a huge debate on the 3rd floor. Actually, it's these clinker bricks that are the tail that's wagging the dog, and that's not unusual when these things come up to us, because when you have 7 rabbis, you get 8 opinions, right? So hopefully they are clear in terms of the general direction, and I think Commissioner Fresco is correct saying we're not trying to design your building. We're actually trying to preserve your building, but you have enough ammunition now to go in the best direction, I think, for everybody. So with that in mind, is there any other comments? The grappler in chief will now speak.
Well, I'll just say that I've heard tonight a number of prisms through which to view these questions. I've heard people weighing outcomes, parking versus preservation. when I would say it's really the findings. The findings are the way that we are to look at this. So when it comes back to us, we should, in my opinion, set aside those as the lead considerations and look at the findings. And within the findings, these issues will come up. But it's first and foremost the findings, and I know there are other considerations when dealing with historic resources or potentially designated historic resources, but it starts with the findings, and then it ultimately will end with the findings.
Okay, any other comments? Are we ready to vote?
Let's vote.
Okay. So then motion is to continue to the nearest opportunity for the applicant to come back to us. And, okay, this will be a voice vote then. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Okay, so we hope to see you back soon, and I hope it's been valuable for you to hear about these things firsthand.
Now you know what hoops mean in Santa Monica.
Okay.
Thank you, Ross. Do we have anything else?
Yeah, we need to know who's going to speak on the Rainbow Garden.
I'm not here, so.
And I abstained, so.
We don't have
It's
to.
Mario.
We don't have to
Unless.
speak. I mean,
No.
we don't have to speak on the appeal.
Well,
It's his determination. He just wanted to bring it up later.
yeah.
So.
You missed it. It was moved ahead of the agenda.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, to allow parents who are watching movies to make it to the object of their real passions. So we didn't think you cared about them.
Future agenda items.
Good.
Okay.
Um,
Right. I don't have any.
So should I go and speak to the city council regarding this and regarding 401 Montana, the
Well,
park?
he's the designated.
Well, we don't always speak on appeals.
No, I know, but you should.
No, but what I'm saying
He
is,
wants to,
is
by all
no. What I'm saying is, whenever our wisdom is challenged, we should.
Which is daily.
Right. Well, I mean, we saw what happened in Landmarks Commission when they got rolled by the city council. That was not a pretty picture. Not that we would get rolled, but I'm saying we
I don't
need
know. Have any idea what you're talking about?
the tree ordinance.
Oh, the tree.
The tree
The
was
tree.
was chopped down. Basically, I cannot tell a lie.
I thought it had
Well, that is
18-month extension.
Lest Commissioner Perry worry that we are off agenda, that is in fact a future agenda item for this commission based on the action taken by council. So,
And I told Jerry Rubin, if one stick of housing is jeopardized by your tree ordinance, watch out.
Okay, so
I was just one quick thing. Commissioner McKinnon had to leave, and he had raised the question about when the bike and ped action plan updates were coming. If I may just suggest, in support of and recognizing staff's workload, it might be great to have sort of a calendar of what's coming on mobility,
I enjoyed it.
so that we can kind of keep an eye on it, and because we've piled on the requests for different things at different times, and part of what may lead to our repetition may be simply the uncertainty of not knowing what you are thinking about agendizing and what you're not. So.
We get that in our agenda meetings.
Okay, but we don't. You get it, but we don't. So.
You will next year.
Thanks.
I have an agenda item potentially in the future, which is probably way in the future. Someone was talking to me at the R1 workshop yesterday and actually showed me a picture. This is not a really high priority, but it was a really ugly picture of a new house where the garage was put in front of the house. It protruded. It didn't go into the setback, but it was up to the setback, and it was like 10 feet in front of the house. I didn't know we allowed that. Well, we do. West Hollywood does not. So at some point in the future, I would really love to look at changing that because it was a really unattractive look for the street, to have the garage actually dominate the front yard.
Just put a really big hedge around it.
That's true. That's true. Do away with all hedges.
We should probably say that before we meet, well, I guess it's before we meet again, there will be non-quorum site visits, as we discussed, right, to some of these co-housing locations.
One so far.
Yeah.
We're ready to adjourn, so we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, he knows somebody. So Roxanne.